Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Welcome to the 13th annual NIH Matilda White Riley Honors Event. I'm Bill Riley. I direct the Office of Behavioral and Social Science Research here at the NIH. My pleasure to welcome you to our virtual event this year. So if you've ever doubted the need to celebrate the value of behavioral and social science research to our health and to our society, you need to look no further than our current global pandemic. And the mitigation of infection transmission via social and behavioral change that we're going through right now. To our current national crisis of racial injustice and the need to better control the use of excessive force by those in positions of power. I think we've been studying that since Zimbardo and the Stanford prison experiments, and to address continued racial prejudice and discrimination in our society. In the context of these crises, we take this half day to celebrate behavioral and social science research and importance to health and to society. We have an excellent distinguished lecturer this year, Toni Antonucci, and later this morning we will honor her lifetime achievement in the behavioral and social sciences, consistent with the research values of Matilda White Riley. We also have selected 4 early stage investigator paper awardees this year from among hundreds of submissions. Each year we honor these awardees, but we also honor Matilda White Riley. For those of you who don't know, Matilda was recruited to NIH at an age when most of us have already retired or have thought about retiring, to develop the Behavioral and Social Science Research Division and Social Research Division of the recently created National Institute on Aging. She co-authored her first book under the name Matt White to avoid gender bias among technical book publishers. In the 1940s, she co-founded the Market Research Company of America, one of the early pioneers of applying polling data and other social science research methods to market research. She served on the faculty both at Rutgers and at Baldwin College, and was the first female full professor at Baldwin. She was a leader of the American Sociological Association, serving as its executive director and as its president. At NIH, in addition to being the first director of NIA's Behavioral and Social Research Division, she also co-chaired the NIH Search Steering Committee on the Institute of Medicine's report on health and behavior, which served as a blueprint for behavioral and social science research at the NIH, and as an impetus for the creation of the Office of Behavioral and Social Science Research, of which we now celebrate its 25th anniversary. She represented behavioral and social science research to NIH leadership and to policymakers, and coordinated behavioral and social science research across the NIH. Essentially, Matilda White Riley functioned as OBSSR before there was an OBSSR. Therefore, each year we honor our early stage investigator paper awardees and our distinguished lecturer, but we also honor at this time Matilda White Riley's contribution in the behavioral and social sciences at the NIH. I want to thank you for your attention. I'm now going to turn this over to Dr. Bill Elwood, who's coordinated the early stage paper competitions each year, to moderate our early stage paper awardee presentations. Bill?
Thanks so much, Dr. Riley. In addition to Dr. Bill Riley's description of Dr. Matilda White Riley, I think it's worth noting that after Dr. Matilda retired from NIH, she retired back to Bowdoin College to continue her work as an interdisciplinary lead scientist who leaned into young scholars to help them refine and amplify their ideas. And that's also the legacy that informs our early stage investigator competition. And NIH has, of course, many ways to provide opportunities for early stage and new PIs. And the ESI competition follows that. It asks researchers without an R01 and within 10 years of achieving their terminal degree to submit a first authored peer-reviewed article published within the preceding 12 months that we disseminate across the agency to NIH scientists for peer review, and we ask them to rate these articles on three criteria of excellence that Dr. White Riley originally outlined. The first is the impact on theory and method. The second is the integration of individual and social system influences. And the third is the integration of scientific discipline. Since we started this competition 5 years ago, we receive each year hundreds of submissions, and our scientists rank them roughly in the same way that at numerical scores that to our peer review system. Today, we four outstandingly scored scholars will present on their work and some opportunities that they're working on based on their original article. It's important to note that both these awardees today, as well as all the submissions we received, are diffused across the agency, continuing NIH's commitment to encouraging new investigators, as well as Dr. White Riley's commitment to attend to and to encourage all emerging new investigators. I encourage you personally to read our four awardees and our distinguished scholars' biographies on the website and on the agenda. So my introductions are short. Let me now turn things over to Dr. Julia Jensanke, who received her master's in public policy from Johns Hopkins University, her doctorate in behavioral and community health from the University of Maryland, and now is a postdoctoral fellow in the labs at the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities. Julia?
Great, thank you. So thank you, Dr. Riley, for the opening remarks, and thank you, Dr. Elwood, for the introduction. It is my great honor to receive the Early Stage Investigator Award from NIH OBSSR. Today, I will present my research on investigating the influence of e-cigarette marketing exposure among youth and young adults in the US. Next slide, please. So first, some information about study backgrounds. As we all know, since e-cigarettes entering the US market in 2009, e-cigarette use among young people has increased drastically. Mounting evidence has shown that e-cigarette use is directly linked to nicotine addiction, future combustible tobacco and substance use, and respiratory lung injuries, all of which lead to increased risks of mortality. In 2018, the US Surgeon General declared that e-cigarette use among young people is a national epidemic. However, in 2019, current e-cigarette use prevalence continued to rise to 20% among teenagers, and the prevalence of every e-cigarette use among teenagers rose to about 35%. Each year, in the US alone, the tobacco industry spends more than $9 billion on tobacco advertising and promotion, and this spending has significantly increased on e-cigarette products in recent years. Many of those marketing strategies are aimed at attracting young people to start using tobacco. Studies after studies have confirmed that exposure to tobacco advertising and promotion increases the chance for young people to initiate and regularly use tobacco. Those research studies have adopted behavior and social sciences theories and frameworks such as socio-ecological model and social cognitive theory to explain how tobacco marketing practices may influence young people's tobacco using environment, cognitive perceptions towards tobacco products, as well as actual tobacco use behavior change. So it may not be surprising to you that one important factor promoting e-cigarette use is the pervasive and unregulated e-cigarette marketing practices in the country. Unlike cigarette marketing that has been heavily regulated and restricted, currently there is a lack of regulation to restrict or limit e-cigarette marketing practices. Until today, the country has not banned e-cigarette advertising in any channels. E-cigarette advertising can still be seen on TV, magazines, internet, social media, music festivals, and more prevalently in tobacco and vape shops. Many current marketing strategies used by the tobacco and the vaping industry are appealing to young people. For example, as you can see from the pictures on the right of this slide, Teenagers can very easily access e-cigarette marketing from social media sites such as Instagram, as well as other public channels such as billboards or posters from gas stations and convenience stores. Previous rigorous longitudinal and experimental studies that show the influence of cigarette marketing have informed the regulations to curb cigarette marketing practices. However, as for e-cigarette marketing, there was a lack of longitudinal research to examine the association. With the traditional cross-sectional study design, it is impossible to tell if e-cigarette marketing exposure precedes e-cigarette use behavior change or the other way around. Therefore, there was a critical need for longitudinal studies to demonstrate the temporal relationship between e-cigarette marketing exposure and e-cigarette use behavior change. Next slide, please. So with the goal to address this research gap, I conducted a secondary data analysis to investigate the research question: is exposure to e-cigarette marketing associated with subsequent e-cigarette experimentation among youth and young adult never tobacco users? We used the US Population Assessment of Tobacco and Health Study, the PASS study, to explore this association. The PASS study is a nationally representative longitudinal cohort study that investigates youth and adult tobacco use behavior change annually since the launch of the first wave data in 2013. We used data from both waves 2 and 3 of the PASS youth and adult surveys and retained youth and young adult respondents who had never used tobacco at baseline, including e-cigarettes. We only included never tobacco users in our sample because we were interested in learning about the e-cigarette marketing influence among young people who had very limited tobacco use experience, and therefore may be the target of the tobacco and the vaping industry's marketing strategies. As for the measures, we used exposure to e-cigarette marketing sources at baseline as the main independent variable. The e-cigarette marketing exposure in the PASS survey include the exposure from the following sources: television, posters or billboards, websites or social media, newspapers or magazines, radio, the events like fairs and festivals. We also measured e-cigarette use susceptibility, which is defined as having intentions or interests in using e-cigarette products in the future. E-cigarette use susceptibility is often considered as a precursor of e-cigarette use experimentation. E-cigarette use experimentation at 1-year follow-up was used as a dependent variable and was defined as having ever used e-cigarettes, even just 1 or 2 puffs between baseline and follow-up assessments. We then used weighted multivariable logistic regressions adjusted for baseline covariates, which included participants' sociodemographic backgrounds and their internalizing and externalizing mental health problems. The models were also stratified by e-cigarette use susceptibility to understand the influence of e-cigarette marketing among young people with and without interest in trying the product at baseline. Next slide, please. So here are the results related to e-cigarette marketing exposure. As you can see in figure 1, about over 70% of US youth and the young adult never tobacco users were exposed to e-cigarette marketing, and about 2 marketing channels on average at baseline. Those who were susceptible to e-cigarette use were exposed to more than 2 sources of marketing channels. I also want to point out that when examining the subgroups who were more likely to be exposed to e-cigarette marketing, we find that among teenagers, non-Hispanic African Americans were about 20% more likely to be exposed to e-cigarette marketing than non-Hispanic whites. And youth and the young adults with internalizing and externalizing mental health problems were also more likely to be exposed than those who did not report the problems. And regarding the results related to e-cigarette experimentation, we found that at 1-year follow-up, about 4.9% and 4.5% of youth and young adult never tobacco users experimented with e-cigarettes. This equaled to about 8 million people in the country. Next slide, please. This slide shows the results of the main association that we were investigating. As you can see from figure 2, we find that exposure to e-cigarette marketing at baseline was associated with e-cigarette experimentation at follow-up among overall use in the young adult never tobacco users. Use in young adults who were exposed to e-cigarette marketing were about 1.5 times and 2.7 times as likely to experiment with e-cigarettes, respectively, at follow-up. When looking at the stratified models, we find that non-susceptible youth and susceptible young adults are being greatly influenced by e-cigarette marketing. I want to highlight that for susceptible young adults, those who were exposed to marketing were about 8 times as likely to experiment with e-cigarettes at follow-up as compared to those who were not exposed. Next slide, please. So we have several main conclusions from this study. Our study is one of the first longitudinal cohort research to find the association between e-cigarette marketing exposure and future e-cigarette experimentation among tobacco-naive young people. There may be several potential pathways to explain such association. First, by seeing e-cigarette advertising, youth may develop e-cigarette use susceptibility and positive perceptions about e-cigarette use. Second, young people may make non-rational decisions of trying e-cigarettes on impulse after seeing e-cigarette advertising, especially when e-cigarettes were available to them at the time of marketing exposure. Third, e-cigarette marketing information may also make it easier for young people to access and purchase e-cigarettes from tobacco shops or vape shops or retail websites, and at a lower cost. We also conclude that susceptible young adults who are very likely to be influenced by e-cigarette marketing should be the target for understanding the influence of e-cigarette marketing exposure. Finally, history has taught us public policies that make tobacco more difficult to access and use are extremely effective at curbing population-wide tobacco use. We believe that using the results from this study, policy interventions that enable and strengthen e-cigarette marketing restrictions will be extremely helpful in preventing tobacco-naive young people from frequently encountering e-cigarette marketing and initiating e-cigarette products. Next slide, please. So given the knowledge that e-cigarette marketing is influential in changing young people's behavior, for the next step of my research, I will investigate the specific features of e-cigarette marketing materials that promote young people's neuropsychological responses and positive perceptions and intentions of using e-cigarettes. As you can see from the figure below, there are 4 candidate features that I think are important to explore. First, appealing flavors such as candy, fruits, and desserts. Second, marketing claims that describe or portray the social and health benefits of vaping. Third, attractive celebrities and young models and their glamorous lifestyles. And finally, price promotions, including coupons or reduced prices. This type of study will really help us understand which features of e-cigarette advertising may be the most influential in changing young people's perceptions and behavior. The results from this study will help inform the policy strategies to alter or remove the influential features to eventually reduce the impact of e-cigarette marketing among young people. And finally, I want to say that with many competing public health problems we're currently facing in the country, e-cigarette use among young people still remains an alarming issue that needs continued attention and efforts from policymakers, teachers, parents, and healthcare providers. And I firmly believe that e-cigarette marketing with use-appealing features should be the target for public health interventions in order to address the e-cigarette use epidemic in the country. Next slide, please. So next, I want to use this invaluable opportunity to thank my NMHD mentors, Drs. Choi, Naples, and Prestably, who helped guide my research and career development in the past 3 years since I was a pre-doctoral fellow at NMHD. I especially want to thank Dr. Kelvin Choi, who instigated my research interest in tobacco marketing and counter-marketing strategies. I also want to thank the NIH Intramural Training and Education OIT program for providing extremely helpful resources for me to learn and grow academically and professionally. Second, I want to acknowledge the co-authors of this paper. They provide extensive expertise and guidance on e-cigarette marketing research. Thanks for making research collaboration extremely fun and rewarding. Last but not least, I want to thank the PASS study team from NIH and FDA for making this high quality data available to the public. I'm a very thankful user of the PASS survey data. I used the survey data for my doctoral dissertation and many other studies that helped launch my research career in studying flavored tobacco use behavior and tobacco marketing. Thanks very much for the work on this important study. And that is all for my presentation today. Again, it is my great honor to present this study to you all and receive this award from OBSSR. I thank you for your attention and I welcome any questions that you may have on this particular study or e-cigarette marketing in general. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Julia. First, Julia, could you talk a little bit more about your methodology in accounting for the exposure to, frequency, and types of promotional materials for e-cigarettes that the survey participants were exposed to?
Sure, that is a very good question. So the PASS study included several channels of marketing exposure that I just introduced, including exposure to e-cigarette marketing through television, posters or billboards, websites, social media, newspapers, magazines, radio, and events like fairs or festivals. So those 6 different channels are the main channels of exposure for youth and young adults currently to see e-cigarette marketing materials. So in my analysis, I look at the influence of e-cigarette marketing exposure on e-cigarette use behavior change through individual channels, and also look at overall, if they're exposed to any of those channels, what kind of influence they're having. I also look at the cumulative exposure. So for example, how many channels in total they're exposed, and then as well as their influence on e-cigarette use behavior. And then the results are very interesting. Overall, you know, about 70% of exposure to e-cigarette marketing channel. And then for youth, one of the highest exposure is posters or billboards or television. Apparently, teenagers are very likely to be exposed to e-cigarette marketing through those channels. And also for young adults, it's actually also posters or billboards. We're assuming or suspect that those posters are exposed through retail channels such as gas station, convenience stores, or corner stores. Which really sell to e-cigarette products in a very large scale. So that is the overall kind of the channels that I investigated in this study. Thank you for the question.
Oh, not at all. I have, do you have, in your work, have you been able to see any influences of exposure to the anti-smoking campaigns, such as the Truth campaign and other anti-tobacco campaigns?
And so yes, so in this particular study, I did not explore the anti-e-cigarette or anti-tobacco use campaigns, such as if Choose campaign or FDA's anti-e-cigarette campaign or use prevention campaigns. So, but many other studies have shown that those kind of campaigns is effective in preventing use from starting tobacco products or e-cigarette products, or help with passing the cessation smoking or e-cigarette use cessation messages to the youth and the young adults. So hopefully maybe next step of my research, not just looking at the pro e-cigarette marketing, but I think it will be also interesting to look at the anti e-cigarette messages and whether those messages will be helpful for youth to have more knowledge or about this product and how they can quit if they want to quit e-cigarettes. So that's a very good point. Thank you. Mark, do you have any other questions? Any other questions from the audience?
Yes, ma'am. One more. I don't know if you and your colleagues looked at earlier tobacco advertising before that was curtailed. Do you, or looking at the literature, do you see any parallels between past tobacco campaigns that promoted smoking and the strategies you see in the 21st century for e-smoking?
Sure. So that's a very good question. So literature that, about 10 years ago on cigarettes marketing research has demonstrated this very strong linkage between exposure to cigarette marketing and cigarette smoking progression among young people. So around this time, since about 10 years ago, e-cigarettes become really popular in the country. We've seen this trend of using the tobacco and vaping industry using social media and the websites to attract young people. Young people are their main consumers of social media sites. And then there are some of the findings we see are those companies are paying social media influencers to promote their brands or promote their products. Interestingly, some studies have shown that young people, especially teenagers, do not consider those social media influencers as a marketing strategy.
Now, Mark, if you could forward the slide, I'd like to introduce Dr. Drew Rothenberg, who received his PhD in child clinical psychology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and has two appointments as a research scientist at Duke University Center for Child and Family Policy, as well as a postdoctoral clinical associate.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Elwood, and for everything that you and Dr. Riley and the whole team have done to put together this wonderful set of talks and presentations and honors. It's just such a privilege to be here. And I'm super excited to also be following Dr. Chen Sankey, because I think a lot of the policy implications that she talked about in her talk may apply to some of the findings that I have to present too. So briefly, I'm interested in examining the internalizing pathway to substance use in 10 cultural groups around the world. And that's what I'll be presenting my talk on today. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what that means and what that is right now. So if you could advance to the next slide, that would be great. Thank you. So my current work arose from this international problem that illicit substance use accounts for the largest percentage of global health burden in 10 to 24-year-olds, along with different mental illnesses. And national and international health organizations have prioritized substance use prevention for adolescents as a result of this emerging crisis. So some of the key questions that I asked of myself and our team asked was whether we could predict which youth begin to use substances early on in adolescence in many different cultural groups all over the world. So are there these developmental precursors or pathways that start in early childhood that can lead to later adolescent substance use? And furthermore, are there differences or similarities in those pathways in different cultures all over the world? So to examine this question, I utilized data from the Parenting Across Cultures project, which is a longitudinal study of almost 1,100 children, followed from ages 8 to 14, their mothers and their fathers. This study examines all sorts of different parenting and child mental health indicators over time, and I'll talk about the ones that I use in just a second. But the families recruited from the study were from 10 different cultural groups or societal groups, that included families from Shanghai, China, Medellin, Colombia, Naples and Rome, Italy, Kisumu, Kenya, Manila in the Philippines, Chiang Mai, Thailand, and Durham, North Carolina in the United States, where approximately equal samples of white, Black, and Latinx youth and their families were recruited. Remarkably, 93% of the sample was retained for the entire duration of this study for the results that I'm going to present right now. And subsamples were socioeconomically representative of the cities from which they came. So I think that that's also important to note. The method that was utilized in the study was we recruited the sample through letters sent home from schools. Interviews were conducted with families separately. I at participant chosen locations, and measures were translated and back translated by native speakers of each language. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So the next thing that I'd like to talk about is sort of a little bit more of the nitty-gritty theoretical framework that informed this study. That theoretical framework emerges from Andrea Hassung and colleagues at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And it starts with this underlying depressive pathway. So the idea is that behavioral inhibition at age 8, so the idea that a child might withdraw or be more shy dispositionally than other children in early childhood might predict the emergence of depressive symptoms in that child, as they're not able to connect with their social environment and establish social support in the same way that other children do. Those depressive symptoms then may linger over time. You can go ahead and click on that next animation really quickly. Perfect, thank you. And those depressive symptoms may linger over time until they inform the development of substance use in early adolescence. As a result of the substance use might result from trying to cope with those depressive symptoms because there's no other social support or other coping mechanisms available. So this underlying depressive pathway to substance use was the first pathway that we tried to examine in our study across cultures. Go ahead and click the next animation. A branch of this developmental pathway we were also interested in ran through interpersonal skills. So we began to posit, okay, these children might develop depressive symptoms, and then that might lead them to have more difficulty interacting with others due to withdrawal from social interactions. And so as a result, they might have interpersonal skill deficits that then themselves predict greater depressive symptoms later on and sort of shoot them back on this pathway to adolescent substance use. So you can go ahead and click that next animation. So that's why we looked at interpersonal skills as a second developmental sort of branch of this depressive developmental pathway. The third branch of this depressive developmental pathway to substance use that we looked at was externalizing behavior. So we posited that early or middle childhood depressive symptoms might predict the emergence of aggression, irritability, or other attention-seeking externalizing behaviors as a means for communicating or getting one's way in different social context, because those social skills that might otherwise have been developed weren't available. So these externalizing symptoms might lead youth into social interactions with peers who support higher use, and might lead them to interacting in social contexts with higher opportunities for use. So we also wanted to examine that pathway. Perfect. We are very interested in understanding how these pathways differed across different cultural contexts. We utilized an analytic method where we examined between and within cultural differences in these pathways using multi-level path analysis. So children were nested within cultures, and predictors were grand-mean centered to capture between culture effects, or how these pathways might differ between cultures, and group mean centered to capture within culture effects. So even controlling for between culture differences, whether these pathways persisted across all cultures. So that's the theoretical framework that set up this study. I'll talk to you a little bit about the measures very briefly next, so you can advance to the next slide. Thank you so much. So just very briefly, we measured these pathways in several different ways. So we measured behavioral inhibition at age 8, depressive symptoms from age 9 through 12, and externalizing symptoms at age 10, utilizing the child behavior checklist. Different subscales of that checklist, withdrawn and depressed, subscale for behavioral inhibition, depressive problems for the depressive symptoms construct, and the externalizing problems subscale for the externalizing symptoms construct. And we actually wound up combining mother, father, and child reports of those symptomatologies to be able to examine those constructs. For interpersonal skills, we measured interpersonal skills at age 10, looking at 7 items indicating how skilled a child was in several kinds of interpersonal interactions. Age 12 peer support of substance use was measured by the extent to which peers supported a child's past year involvement in 4 substance use activities: drinking beer and wine, liquor, smoking cigarettes, and using drugs. That was child reported. And opportunities for use at age 12 looked at those same 4 substance use activities, but instead asked the extent to which those children had past year opportunities to engage in them, again, using child reported measures there. And then finally, we actually looked at substance use at age 13 and 14, mother reported use at age 13, child reported use at age 14 over the past 6 months. I'm going to be presenting the results just from the age 14 analyses because they're child self-reported, but the two analyses are very similar in their findings. These substance use frequencies are reported on a never to often scale. You can go ahead and click on that next slide. Perfect. So the first set of results I wanted to talk about were these within culture results. So controlling for differences between cultures, which developmental pathways seem to emerge in many different cultural contexts. So we'll start with that same underlying depressive pathway that we began with. Age 8 behavioral inhibition did in fact predict higher levels of age 9 depressive symptoms. So those, not only did age 8 behavioral inhibition predict higher age 9 depressive symptoms, but those depressive symptoms did indeed seem to persist across time and predict the emergence of higher likelihood of age 14 substance use in adolescence. So it seemed like that underlying depressive pathway did show support in many different cultural groups around the world, even after controlling for between cultural differences. So these, the second set of results I wanted to present was this interpersonal skills branch of the depressive pathway. That wasn't as highly supported. So you can see depressive symptoms did indeed predict interpersonal skill deficits, but subsequent interpersonal skill deficits didn't predict depressive symptoms or substance use after that. So we didn't find as much support for that pathway. So age 9 depressive symptoms did, however, predict age 10 externalizing symptoms. So this externalizing branch of the depressive pathway was present in many different cultural groups. These age 10 externalizing symptoms did predict higher peer supportive use, which predicted higher subsequent substance use across cultures, but we actually didn't find a direct effect between age 10 externalizing symptoms and age 12 opportunities for use. However, opportunities for use themselves, probably unsurprisingly, predicted greater age 14 substance use. And then finally, an interesting direct effect that we didn't expect to see emerged from externalizing symptoms. So age 10 externalizing symptoms did predict higher levels of age 14 substance use as well. So you can see the underlying depressive pathway and several depressive externalizing pathways predicted age 14 substance use in many different cultures all over the world. Go ahead and click again. Thank you. So that's within cultures. You know, what is that captures after we're controlling for these differences between cultures, what pathways might emerge in many different cultures. But we were also interested in what are some between culture differences that predict age 14 substance use in some cultures, but not others. And the only predictor that really emerges significant in our data set was age 12 opportunities for use, which is why I was really interested in Dr. Chensanki's results as well, because it seemed like these two findings dovetail very nicely. In cultures with more frequent opportunities for substance use, like Italy, Kenya, and Colombia, higher levels of opportunities for use predicted greater likelihood of substance use. And interestingly, in all three of these nations, substance use, norms around using substance use was more normative at earlier ages, and actually drinking laws were also, the age of being able to drink or use legal substances was lower in these nations. So it's just an interesting thing to think about as we think about policy implications of these findings. So the last thing I just wanted to present on from the nuts and bolts results is that the effect sizes were moderate, small to moderate in size. So they predicted about, overall, this whole model predicted about 10% of age 14 substance use across all cultures. That within-person developmental pathway model predicted about 9% of variance, and these between cultural differences predicted about 1% of variance. And the model fit fairly well for these analyses. You can go ahead and click on the next slide. So just in summary, I knew I threw a lot of findings at you, so I'll try to distill down the forest for the trees here. Cultures where teens had greater substance use opportunities at age 12 had teens with higher rates of teen-reported age 14 substance use. And so those were our between culture findings. At the within culture level, it seemed like there were several pan-cultural pathways to substance use that emerged. A developmental pathway marked by higher age 8 behavioral inhibition and age 9 to 12 depressive symptoms led to greater substance use. A second developmental pathway marked by age 9 depressive symptoms, but then that externalizing branch where age 10 externalizing behavior and age 12 peer support is also higher led to greater substance use. And a developmental pathway marked by age 9 depressive symptoms, higher age 10 externalizing behavior, and age 12 depressive symptoms, as well as the direct effect of age 12 externalizing behavior led to greater substance use. So you go ahead and click the next slide. So for me, there are several interesting conclusions and implications to this work. I hope for you too. So first, I think, is this larger methodological point. I think separating between and within culture effects allows identification of unique intervention targets at both national levels from those between cultural differences that we see. So public health interventions like those talked about by Dr. Chen Sankey, thinking about things maybe even like limiting marketing in certain nations to underage youth of substance use products, limiting raising the legal drinking age perhaps would change societal norms. Those types of between culture intervention targets can emerge if you are able to isolate these between culture effects. So so like I was sort of alluding to, public health interventions that focus on limiting opportunities for substance use may be useful at a societal level, like raising the national drinking age. At the family level or that within culture level, it seems like preventative interventions that might be able to target early or middle childhood depressive or externalizing symptoms may curb substance use before it even begins in a variety of cultures around the world. And some programs that do a good job of that are behavioral parent training programs, where parents are taught warmth and control skills that they can then apply to ameliorate child externalizing or internalizing problems. So some of those programs you all might be familiar with in the United States are things like PCIT International, the Incredible Years, Triple B Positive Parenting Program, and Helping a Non-Compliant Child. You can click on the next slide. So the future directions I hope to pursue with this work is to continue cross-cultural investigation of adolescent and young adult substance use consequences arising from these developmental pathways. So as you can see, like so far, I've examined early substance use, but I'm very interested in following this cohort of families over time to see what consequences in young and middle adulthood emerge from this early substance use, see if we can link these age 8 pathways all the way to age 30 outcomes. The other thing that I'm interested in is conducting longitudinal follow-ups of existing early childhood behavioral parent training programs to see if their amelioration of the externalizing and internalizing symptoms earlier in childhood might predict later substance use behaviors. And we actually have a collaboration with the University of Miami Parent-Child Interaction Therapy Program that might make this possible, where we could go back and recapture these youth who had been in the PCIT behavioral parent training program years ago, whether that actually curbed their substance use if we were able to re-interview them now. And then finally, I was interested in examining a nationally representative, internationally really representative data set to examine how differences in parenting, mental health, and opportunities for substance use alter adolescent substance use around the world over time. So I really would love to get at some of those between culture effects with nationally representative samples from around the world. And actually, UNICEF has an amazing data set that might be able to be used to investigate these sorts of questions called the Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey data set. So I'm working on collaborations with the UNICEF Office of Research in Florence, Italy right now to see if those type of data can be brought to bear on this question. Go ahead and click on the next slide. So finally, I would just like to end by giving a million thanks to everyone that made this work possible. NICHD and the Fogarty International Center are incredible funders who have just continuously supported this study for years, and we thank them so much for this opportunity. The selfless participants of the Parenting Across Cultures project are also, we owe a debt of gratitude to. And me personally, I couldn't have done any of this work without incomparable mentors like Jennifer Lansford, Jason, Jen, and Andrea Sung. The published paper citation is below in case y'all are interested in checking it out. And of course, feel free to contact me at any time. I love collaborating. I love talking about these issues. So don't be shy. Feel free to reach out. So that is everything. That's my whole presentation. And I'm looking forward to hearing y'all's questions. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Thank you so much, Drew. Great job. And thanks to all of our participants. My next bid is for you. Sorry to eat into your time, Drew. We've had a great many more people join our event. For that, we're very grateful. Drew, got a question about your sample. Does your sample, is it based on the original large international project? And regardless, did you have any hypotheses about other international influences on culture? For example, there's a large Western expat community in Chiang Mai, and the Manila is the capital of the Philippines. which was an American Commonwealth uh, um, for quite a number of decades as well. And someone's just wondering how you might have accounted for that.
Those are both fabulous questions. So I'll take both parts of that question one at a time. So the first question is of that original sample, how many participated in this study? That full 1,083 person sample did indeed, everybody was included in this study from that sample. So we were able to capture each of those different cultural groups in the sample, which is a really exciting thing for us to do. I should note so we also recruited participants for the outside of those 1,100, almost 1,100 families. We had another subsample from Sweden that we also had in the original study, but we didn't include here because actually, interestingly enough, the Swedish IRBs were not comfortable with asking youth that young about their substance use. So that particular subsample is excluded, but it wasn't a part of those almost 1,100 children I presented on. As far as sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
As far as those Western, these Western influences on culture through expat communities or other things like that, I think that's a really interesting question. And we've actually pursued this question across several lines of work in the larger Parenting Across Cultures project. And one of the things that we seem to, and I should mention too, that the Parenting Across Cultures project is a consortia of investigators at 17 institutions all over the world. So folks have weighed in about this from each of their cultures, and I think that Western influences sort of like traditionally Western held cultural values like individualism and autonomy, and the transition towards more individualism and autonomy-seeking behaviors in adolescence is something that seems to be increasingly adopted in at least each of the cultural samples that we investigate all over the world. So it's potentially possible that we're seeing those Western, quote unquote, Western cultural influences or more autonomy, individually seeking influences, potentially driving a lot of the similarity across cultures that we're seeing at the within culture level. I hope that makes sense. Feel free to follow up if you have a further question about that.
This follow-up question from another participant, I think fits very nicely. Given the small amount of variance accounted for, what variables do you think are missing from these data that might explain more variance?
That's a absolutely fascinating question. I think one thing that I would love to get to include as another variable in this analysis are predispositions towards impulsivity or risk taking. There's some of that captured by externalizing behavior more generally, but there's a and I'm sure there's probably tens or hundreds of people on this call that are familiar with this literature, but there's a well-documented literature that there's an externalizing pathway to substance use that runs through behavioral disinhibition or sort of approach-oriented behavior that then might morph into impulsivity or risk-taking at the individual level. That would be a really interesting additional variable to investigate here, given its prominence in a lot of the developmental literature examining these precursors to later substance use. That also might be a really interesting variable to examine differences in across culture, because different cultures have sort of different sanctions against impulsive or risk-taking behavior. So I'm really wondering if a next step for including another variable in analyses like this is investigating that sort of risk-taking or impulsivity. Great question.
Excellent. Thanks, Drew. If you do have more questions, please do send them in. We need to move on, but we can connect your question and Drew's answer if you put them into the chat box and include your name and email address. But if we could move forward, Denise, it's time to introduce Dr. Jamie Slaughter-Acey, who received her PhD in maternal and child health epidemiology at the University of Illinois in Chicago. She had her postdoctoral fellowship at Michigan State University. And now she's at the University of Minnesota School of Public Health, with not only an assistant professorship, but appointments at multiple research centers. Dr. Slaughter-Acey, please.
Thank you. I just want to echo my the other scholars that went before me. I am really honored to be able to present this work. Given that 3 out of every 4 women in the United States will have at least one birth in their lifetime, prenatal care remains a critical anchor in women's health care. Prenatal care may also represent the opportunity to reconnect women with the healthcare system since leaving their PA provider, as well as the opportunity to identify and monitor underlying chronic medical conditions or pregnancy complications. And this is important given that African American women are 2 to 3 times more likely to have pregnancy complications, as well as present with multiple comorbidities, and they have a higher risk of maternal morbidity and mortality. Despite this greater risk, African American women are less likely than white women to utilize prenatal care as well as care post delivery. Next. Experiences that elicit the adoption of psychological stress responses and coping strategies may influence the way members of marginalized groups engage or disengage with institutional environments like the healthcare system, where discrimination, prejudice, and antagonism are perceived to occur. And a 2017 report on African Americans' experiences of discrimination showed that Blacks are about 20 to 30% of Blacks are less likely to engage or engage with healthcare or call the police when needed for fear of discrimination. Next. Differential treatment in and outside the healthcare system may be linked with underutilization. However, the majority of research has focused on differential treatment within the healthcare setting. Next. Another aspect of the experience of race that may impact treatment of African Americans and other women of color is discrimination due to skin color, also called colorism. Colorism, which is a derivative of cultural racism, is a system that assigns privilege and opportunity to an individual based upon their skin color. And it tends to furnish this privilege to individuals with lighter skin tone or or more phenotypic characteristics that are perceived to be emblematic of whiteness. Colorism is of note. Colorism is more pervasive in places with histories that are embedded with slavery and colorism, like the U.S., colonialism, like the U.S. Next. Colorism has been associated with access to health promoting resources and health outcomes. It's also been suggested that colorism may be more salient for Black women than Black men, since mass media and other industries such as beauty and fashion perpetuate ideals of beauty that value ideas of whiteness. Next. For this study, we examined how experiences of discrimination in everyday life, in particular racial microaggressions, influenced African Americans' receipt of prenatal care. We chose to look at racial microaggressions, which are those daily race-related hassles that may be subtle or innocuous, put downs or degradations, because racial microaggressions in the post-civil rights era are often encountered with more frequency than major experiences of racial discrimination. It's important to note that racial microaggressions, because of their nature, often create an atmosphere of expectation that something racist may occur. So, operating under the theory that skin tone based mistreatment in tandem with racial discrimination may exacerbate African American women's um, engagement with prenatal care, we also investigated whether women's shade of skin color modified the relationship between racial microaggressions and prenatal care. Next slide. To answer these questions, we use data from the Life Course Influences on Fetal Environment study, which is one of the few studies in the United States to have measures on both skin tone, racial discrimination, and pregnancy outcomes. The study includes a little more than 1,400 Black or African American women who are aged 18 to 45 years old and delivered a singleton live birth at a hospital located in metropolitan Detroit between 2009 and 2011. This hospital was chosen because it has um, provides services to women in all three counties that make up the core of the metropolitan Detroit area. Maternal interview data was collected via maternal interviews that occurred 24 to 48 hours postpartum, as well as through medical record abstraction. Next. Racial microaggressions was measured using the daily life experiences of racism and bother scale developed by Shelley Harrell. This scale includes 20 items that represent microaggressions and and it asks not only about the occurrence, but also the stressfulness or how much these types of microaggressions bother an individual. And note that a higher score represents greater experiences of microaggressions. Maternal maternal skin tone was assessed via a single question that asked women to self-report their skin color using a Likert scale, ranging from very dark brown to very light brown. And we categorized women into three groups: light, medium, and dark, given that literature in the social sciences suggests that women who are in the middle of this skin color continuum have different experiences from both light women who are of lighter skin or darker skin. For outcome, we used a binary measure of prenatal care, which looked at no prenatal care versus entering prenatal care prior to 7th month of gestation. In the paper, we also look at prenatal care by trimester of entry, but those results will not be reported here due to sake of time. Next, and then in our analysis, we controlled for maternal age, education, health insurance, parity, current residence, employment status, and receipt of WIC or food stamps. Approximately 25% of women in life had no or late prenatal care. This figure presents um, uh, descriptives for racial microaggressions by prenatal care status. We note a nonlinear relationship between maternal skin tone and experiences of racial microaggressions, and that women on the ends of the color continuum with no prenatal care had the highest mean daily life experiences scores. Next. Looking at the relationship between perceived racial microaggressions and no prenatal care, we find that the odds of no prenatal care is greater for women with a daily life experiences score greater than the median. And this was also true when we looked at the DLEB or the daily life experiences subscales, both occurrence and bothered separately. Next. Bringing skin tone into the discussion, we find that maternal skin tone modifies the relationship, the racial discrimination prenatal care relationship in the same nonlinear fashion as our descriptive slide. For women on the ends of the colored continuum, but not the middle, experiences of discrimination were associated with the odds of no prenatal care. Again, this was true for both of the subscales, the occurrence of microaggressions as well as how much they bothered women. So key findings, women who report greater experiences of discrimination in the form of racial microaggressions were 31% more likely to have delayed prenatal care compared to women who reported experiencing fewer racial microaggressions. We noted the mean daily life experience score varied by maternal skin tone, with women on either ends of the color continuum reporting more experiences of discrimination than women with medium brown skin tone. Light and dark brown African American women with DLEB scores greater than the median were more likely to have delayed prenatal care. However, this was not true for women with medium brown skin tone. Next slide. Skin tone is one of the most notable physical attributes. It's one of our most notable physical attributes. As a visible cue, it can elicit racial bias and discrimination by triggering culturally embedded racial stereotypes and prejudice. Given that we looked at a measure of everyday discrimination, racial microaggressions, which represent those chronic or episodic daily race-related hassles, and can lead or create an atmosphere of expectation that something racist will happen. It is important to consider how experiences of everyday racism may lead women to disengage from the healthcare system, possibly through avoidance or hypervigilance. Our findings may seem a bit counterintuitive given that colorism assigns privilege to individuals with lighter skin tone. However, colorism is quite complex, and the way that skin tone moderated the association may be a function of both in-group colorism, which is perpetuated by Blacks, and out-group colorism perpetuated by whites and other racial or ethnic groups, as well as the hyper-residential segregation of metropolitan Detroit. So just some future directions. This work is, since this work is quite nuanced, it's the first study to look at colorism with respect to the perinatal health of Black women. I'm continuing to use the life study to explore the social salience of skin tone in relationship to Black maternal health. I'm currently working on a paper that looks at gendered colorism, pregnancy BMI, as well as how Black identity, the centrality of Blackness, how important it is to one's self-concept, moderates the relationship between maternal skin tone and birth outcomes. And then also, I was recently awarded an R21 that began about a month ago to investigate the salience of skin color in relationship to women's pre-pregnancy cardiometabolic health and their subsequent birth outcomes using data from the coronary artery risk development in young adult study. And we'll also be looking at how skin color is associated with both psychosocial stressors and resilience resources for Black women. Next slide. I just want to acknowledge all of the Black mothers who entrusted us with their data. I want them to know that I am listening. I hear you. Your voice matters. I also would like to thank a diverse and interdisciplinary group of collaborators on this study, as well as my R21. None of this would be possible without you. And I want to especially acknowledge Dr. Verna Keith, who is one of the most well-known scholars to study colorism, and to thank her for imparting her wisdom and her encouragement in this process. Next slide. And I'd like to just thank my funders. This work would not have been possible without the support of from the Russell Sage Foundation and NICHD, which funded the life study. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. And first, Jamie, was the interesting U-shaped curve you found in colorism among the pregnant women in your sample. Is that typical for the scale overall among women?
So this is I believe this is the first study to use the racial microaggression scale in association with maternal skin tone. But there's been other research that shows that discrimination within group discrimination, so experiences of discrimination experienced by members of your own racial or ethnic group does have this U-shaped curve. One of the things that we did explore in our data set, since we have two variables that looked at in-group and out-group discrimination, was whether or not women, whether or not one was sort of functioning more than the other. And what we found was that they were actually both functioning. That darker complexioned women reported experiencing greater amounts of in-group of out-group discrimination by whites, and both light and dark complexioned women reported greater experiences of in-group discrimination. However, women who were in that middle reported the least amount of in-group discrimination. So that's why our hypothesis is that it's, both in-group and out-group may be functioning here. And then we also know from a few studies that just colorism is also a function of your social interactions and the racial composition of people in those social interactions, right? So I believe one of last year's recipients has done some work looking at residential segregation as a moderator of colorism.
Got you. Thank you. We have a question as to whether your sample includes all U.S. born, or is there a mix between U.S. born and foreign born Black women?
Right. So the life study, the life study it does include both U.S. and foreign-born Black women. However, only 2% of the 1,400 women are foreign-born. And given the fact that research has shown that U.S. and foreign-born perceive or experience racial discrimination differently, as well as reported differences in in the risk of adverse birth outcomes between U.S. born and foreign born Blacks. We excluded those foreign born Blacks in our study from this analysis. So our findings may only be generalizable to U.S. born African Americans.
I understand. Really complete, if brief, answer. And we have more questions that we can facilitate answers to later, or when we bring you forward to campus when better times permit. Denise, if you please forward the next slide, it's time to turn to Dr. Brad Turnwald, who received his PhD in psychology from Stanford University, where he also was a National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellow, and continues at Stanford as a postdoctoral research fellow as well. Brad?
Thanks so much for the intro, and like my colleagues, I'm really excited to be here today. All right, so if we can go to the next slide, we'll get started. Millions of people can now access personal genetic risk estimates for diseases like Alzheimer's, cancer, and obesity. The extent to which new scientific studies predict genetic associations with diseases has outpaced our understanding of the impact that this information has on the people and the patients who receive it. So while the hope is that learning one's genetic risk will guide precise medical treatments and motivate patient engagement and healthy behaviors, learning one's genetic risk can instill powerful expectations of immutability or determinism, believing that an outcome is fixed. So based in the research tradition of placebo effects and expectancy effects, my team and I asked three key questions. What are the psychological, behavioral, and physiological impacts of receiving personalized genetic risk information? Can merely receiving this information change an individual's risk? And by that I mean, if I learn my genetic risk, can this evoke changes that are consistent with the expected risk profile due to my expectations now that those outcomes are more likely? And third, how does the effect size of perceived genetic risk compare with the effects of actual genetic risk? Answering this question requires isolating the perception of the risk from one's biological risk. To answer these three questions, we ran two experiments where we randomly assigned healthy participants to either believe that they had a high-risk genotype or a protective genotype for obesity due to exercise capacity in experiment 1, or due to not feeling full after eating in experiment 2. These two experiments were designed to be conceptual replications of one another. Next slide, please. Experiment 1 explored the effect of perceived and actual genetic risk for exercise capacity via the CREB1 SNP. This is a single nucleotide polymorphism whose high-risk form is associated with worse aerobic exercise outcomes. So if we walk through the figure here, we first sequence participants' DNA so that we would know whether each individual actually had the high-risk, moderate risk, or protective CREB1 genotype. Then, in the gray boxes at the bottom of the figure, you'll see that for each level of actual genetic risk, we randomly assigned half of the participants to believe that they had a high-risk genotype, and the other half to believe that they had the protective genotype. Once participants were randomized, we then measured gene-relevant outcomes at a baseline session in which participants were naive to genetic risk. So in this first experiment, the gene-relevant outcomes were individuals' cardiorespiratory physiology, their running endurance, and their subjective experience of how hot they felt and how difficult the exercise felt during a maximum effort treadmill test. Then, 1 week later, participants returned to the clinic and just before repeating that same treadmill test, we informed participants of this randomly assigned genetic risk. This allowed us to learn whether outcomes worsened for those who learned that they had the high-risk version of the gene and improved for those who learned that they had the protective version. And so what you can see is that this design allows for within-participant comparisons of how each individual changes from before to after receiving genetic risk information. But it also allows us to have between-participant comparisons at that baseline session where we can assess the effect of actual genetic risk on the outcomes, because some participants must be falsely informed of their genotype in an ethical but believable manner. We worked closely with our IRB to minimize potential risk in a number of ways, which I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A. Next slide, please. So to give you just a taste of what this experiment involved, participants enrolled in a study where they believed that they would learn which exercises and diets are best for them based on their genes. And in this exercise experiment, participants reported to the Stanford Sports Medicine Clinic to run a maximum effort treadmill test. And this test was very difficult. Participants start running at a comfortable speed, and then every 2 minutes, the incline of the treadmill increases by 2.5% until the participant finally indicates that they're completely exhausted and cannot take another step. The test ends up lasting about 12 to 20 minutes, depending on the participant. As you can see with the mask that this participant is wearing, we were able to measure breath-by-breath measurements of cardiorespiratory physiology. And so we measured the carbon dioxide to oxygen exchange rate. This is a metabolic measure of the rate at which the lungs can remove toxic CO2 buildup from the body and replenish the blood with oxygen. We also measured ventilation, and this is the sheer physical amount of air that participants are inhaling and exhaling per minute. Other measures included running endurance, so how long participants were able to run, and participants' subjective experience of how difficult the exercise felt and how hot they felt while running. So participants ran this really difficult test at their baseline session without knowing their genetic risk. And then in the second session, a week later, when they reported to the clinic again, right before they ran this same test, we gave them their genetic test report and a pamphlet, which are depicted here. This detailed their risk level, which they believed to be true, and it gave them specific expectations about how this gene would impact their exercise capacity, how difficult exercise would feel for them, and how it would impact their body heat. Then participants ran this treadmill test again under the exact same time intervals and measures as their baseline when they were naive to genetic risk. Next slide, please. Our results showed that perceived genetic risk changed participants' cardiorespiratory physiology in a self-fulfilling manner. We found that those told that they had the high-risk version of the gene in the red bar significantly decrease in their maximum capacity for CO2 to O2 exchange compared to their own baseline performance 1 week earlier when they were naive to genetic risk. In this case, we saw those informed that they had the protective version of the gene showed a non-significant increase compared to their own baseline. For ventilation, the sheer amount of air that participants moved into and out of their lungs, we saw a similar pattern, where those informed that they had the high-risk version of this gene decreased by about 2 liters of air per minute on average, compared to their own baseline 1 week earlier. Furthermore, longitudinal analyses showed that these differences between the groups who learned that they were high risk or learned that they were protected emerged during those most challenging final minutes of the treadmill test. Next slide, please. Those who learned that they had the high-risk version also decreased their running endurance by about 22 seconds in the red bar there compared to their own baseline. Whereas once again, those who learned they had the protective version didn't change. And perceived genetic risk also changed subjective experience. But for subjective experience, we observed a large benefit for those who learned that they had the protective version of the gene. In the blue bars, they ran about 48 seconds longer than their own baseline before saying that the test felt hard, and about a minute longer before reporting that they felt hot. So taken together, these results from experiment 1 showed that learning of a high-risk or protective genotype for exercise capacity changed participants' exercise capacity in a self-fulfilling manner. This alters their actual risk for exercise capacity. And remember, we didn't just make up this gene. CREB1 is a real gene with multiple papers demonstrating its effects on exercise capacity. Yet, randomly assigning people to expect that their genotype would cause beneficial or negative effects made it so. And finally, I'll show you a table at the end of this talk, but it didn't matter what people's actual genotype was. These effects occurred independently of their actual genetic risk. And for some outcomes, the effect size of perceived risk was similar to or greater than the effect size of actual genetic risk. So these results were interesting, but it had us wondering, would the results translate to a different gene in a different context? Next slide, please. So we tested our key questions again in a new context with new participants, but using the same overall design as in experiment 1. Here, we use the most well-studied gene for obesity, the FTO gene, or fat mass and obesity associated gene. This SNP has over 200 peer-reviewed publications from the last 10 years implicating its role in obesity. And the risk form of FTO is associated with decreased self-reported satiety after eating, as well as blunted gut peptide satiety signals after eating. And so we measured whether merely informing participants that they had the high risk or the protective version of this gene would lead to self-fulfilling effects on their gut peptide physiology and on their self-reported feelings of satiety. So similar to last time, on 2 different occasions, participants came to Stanford hospitals, this time after an overnight fast, and nursing staff collected blood samples from them both before and after participants consumed a 480 calorie meal. Similar to last time, they were naive to genetic risk in the first session. In the second session, we informed them of their genetic risk right before they consumed the meal. We measured GLP-1, or glucagon-like peptide 1. This is a satiety gut peptide that's rapidly released from the intestines after food intake and communicates satiety signals to the brain. We also measured participants' feelings of how full they felt. If we could go to the next slide, please. Conceptually replicating the results of experiment 1, perceived genetic risk changed satiety physiology. So just 15 minutes after consuming this meal, participants in the blue bar who were informed that they had the protective FTO gene experienced about a 2.5-fold increase from their baseline response in terms of their GLP-1 satiety signal. Whereas for those informed that they had the high-risk version of this gene, we actually saw no change in their satiety gut peptide signal. Similarly, participants informed that they had the protective gene felt more full after consuming the meal compared to their own baseline 1 week prior, while again, those informed of high risk did not change from their own baseline. In this study, we actually found that the effect sizes due to perceived genotype were greater than the effect sizes due to actual genetic risk on these outcomes. Next slide, please. So taken together, the results of experiment 2 conceptually replicate and extend experiment 1 using the most well-studied candidate gene for obesity to show that merely learning of genetic risk can alter subjective experience and physiology in a self-fulfilling manner. Across the 2 studies and across outcomes, effect sizes differed depending on the outcome. But in the table here where we compare the effect sizes of actual genetic risk to the effects due to perceived genetic risk, what you can see in the bolded ones is that those are cases where the effect of perceived risk was greater than the effect of actual risk. That these 2 effect sizes are even on the same order of magnitude has implications for practice and patient health. Next slide, please. So these results suggest that medical ethicists and policymakers, clinicians, and the genetic testing industry must wrestle with the thresholds at which revealing genetic risk information is warranted or when it's beneficial for patients. When this information is revealed, we should focus efforts on understanding how to do so in a way that could actually harness this placebo-like benefit for those who learn they're not at risk, which is going to be the majority of individuals for the majority of SNPs, but also minimizes harm in those cases when the individuals find out they are at risk. And third, we must parallel advances in our biological understanding of the genetic underpinnings of disease with an equally sophisticated understanding of how to communicate this information. Successful implementation of precision medicine depends upon both. Next slide, please. In ongoing work, I'm testing the immediate affective or emotional and the inflammatory immune responses to receiving genetic risk information. So while existing research shows that individuals don't feel depressed, they don't feel distressed about their genetic test results at long-term follow-ups, so like 6-month or 12-month follow-ups, and understanding the affective stress and inflammatory immune responses at these time points is important because it could impact the treatment or other health decisions that patients make at that time. And so, for example, some really great research by Susan Persky at the NHGRI and Bill Klein at the NCI show that affective responses, like being in a fear state, can reduce the extent to which individuals believe that lifestyle interventions will be effective. And so understanding the emotional headspace of patients at that time is important for understanding the types of decisions that they might make. Another thing I'm interested in is understanding the context effects and individual differences. And so you may have noticed that in the exercise study, results were primarily driven by those who learned that they had the high risk version decreasing from their baseline performance, while in the eating study, the differences we saw were really driven by the benefits for those informed that they had the protective version of the gene. And so learning where and how we can harness the benefits or where the risks are going to be greatest requires a deeper understanding of the context and individual differences in the patients receiving this information. And finally, one thing I'm really excited about and interested in understanding how these processes unfold over weeks and over months. And so I think that genetic risk information leads individuals into these cyclic processes where their new genetically informed expectations about a health behavior, like I'll get tired of running fast or I feel hotter than other people, these expectations are going to color their subjective experience while doing that behavior, as experiment 1 showed, where they felt hotter. And this could lead them to quit sooner. It could influence motivation to engage in the health behavior at another time, which will limit the health benefits they get from these behaviors, and so on, cycling forward in a self-fulfilling spiral. And so as one individual who was told that they were at risk said in the red box here, when I got tired, I thought of the result and thought, maybe this is the limit my body has. Whereas an individual who learned that they were protected in the blue box here was able to selectively recall times that maybe they didn't feel as tired as other people. Because health behaviors are amenable to such subjective influences and evaluations, it's important to understand this dynamic nature of how these cycles play out over time, because they have the potential to amplify both virtuous and maladaptive effects over time. Next slide, please. I'd like to just close by acknowledging my awesome team, Parker Goyer, Danielle Bowles, Amy Silder, Scott Delp, and Aaliyah Crum, as well as our funders, the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering, the NSF, and the Foundation for the Science of the Therapeutic Encounter. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brad. We had a question come in when you were talking about perceived risk and the biopsychosocial processes that unfold when you get genetic risk information. Do you consider the continuing inflammatory and stress responses, do you expect those to continue to have an influence while people are continuing with their daily lives and experiencing self-fulfilling prophecies?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what's really interesting is when in the really early days of genetic testing, the biggest worry was that this information would be so impactful to people that they would feel so distressed and even depressed and sort of debilitated at the thought of this information. But like I said, some of the great longitudinal work so far has shown that actually people maybe have a little more anxiety if they learn that they're at risk when you follow up a year later, but they're not distressed and they're not depressed at the news. And so actually what I expect is that in this short term that we may see in terms of stress, I don't know that that's actually the main thing going on. I actually think that the psychological repercussions of this new framework that people are given when you get this information, so rather than are more important. So rather than feeling so stressed about it, I think it's going to color how I interpret everything now. It might color how full I feel, how full I expect to feel, how long I think I can run, and all these evaluations. And so I'm really interested in how these cycles unfold over time because I actually expect that those processes are going to be more influential than the really classic stress response pathways that we know so much about from other disease progression.
A question about the explaining genetic risk. Do you has your research led to thoughts about how to reframe explanations in explaining genetic risk to people who have these tests?
Yeah, so I haven't focused as much on that area so far. I think some ideas that would be really promising in that direction would be to emphasize, for a majority of the SNPs that we know about, and especially those that are included in many of these direct-to-consumer genetic testing kits, the percentage of the variance in outcomes explained by many of these is very low. And there was a paper a few years ago that located over 50 different SNPs implicated in obesity that are significant when you look at genome-wide association studies. But collectively, across all these SNPs, they were only explaining about 3% of the variance in terms of obesity and obesity-related outcomes. And so I think one thing that would be really helpful for explaining a majority of SNPs would be to emphasize this percentage of the variance explained or the really small effects that many of these have, because people tend to have this fallacy or this bias where we overweight the genetic contributions compared to what the research suggests any given SNP is going to contribute. I definitely want to add the caveat that there are a few diseases where genetic associations are very predictive, and I think these are different cases that I want to make sure I separate a little bit from the majority of SNPs that people can learn about for health behaviors.
Well done. Thank you so much, Brad. Now it's time. Well, first I want to thank. Now it's time to thank all four of our early stage investigators. I thank you for their presentations, for their scientific excellence, and to you for the questions that we've been able to pose to them during this morning. And also, if we didn't get to your questions, please know that we'll try to do so one-on-one later on. Now I'd like to turn the meeting over to Dr. Erica Spotts, who facilitates our distinguished scholar component of the Matilda White Riley Honors. Erica?
So good morning, everyone. I'm Erica Spotts of the Office of Behavioral and Social Sciences Research and the chair of the Matilda White Riley Distinguished Lecture Selection Committee. Welcome to the 13th Matilda White Riley Distinguished Lecture. The recipient of this award has a research career that has advanced behavioral and social scientific knowledge in areas within NIH's mission. The recipient's research also follows Dr. White Riley's vision through an expanding conceptualization of health and well-being that includes effective cognitive, affective, and social functioning and quality of life, behavioral social science research that results in improving the lives of people in society, illuminating the complex and dynamic interplay among processes at multiple levels, the influence of social and behavioral factors on physical health and the utility of this knowledge for clinical practice and health policy, life course perspectives on development, health, and well-being of individuals and societies, and research approaches that build theory and methods in the advancement of knowledge on health and well-being. The NIH community nominates researchers for this award, and the recipient is then selected by committee that I need to thank now. This year's committee comprises Valerie Mahone, Carmen Moten, April O, Mariella Shirley, Michael Sterrett, and Pamela Thornton. This committee volunteers their time and effort to reading all of the nominations that come in and then selecting one from among many deserving nominees. I would like to thank this year's committee for their service. I wish we could do a round of applause, but that doesn't work very well virtually. So I hope the committee considers themselves well applauded. Although she probably needs little introduction, it is now with great pleasure that I present to you this year's Matilda White Riley Lecturer, Dr. Toni Antonucci. She is Elizabeth M. Duvin Collegiate Professor of Psychology and Senior Research Scientist at the Institute for Social Research Life Course at the University of Michigan. Dr. Antonucci's research focuses on social relations and health across the lifespan, including the family, lifespan, and life course development, multi-generational relations, adult development, and aging, and comparative studies of social relations and health in the United States, Europe, the Middle East, and Japan. Rather than take up precious time, I will turn the stage, as it were, over to her so that she can share with you. If we were in person, I would now ask her to come up to the podium to receive her award. But given the current circumstances, please know that we will send her award to her as soon as we are able. For the moment, I will ask Dr. Antonucci to begin her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erica. What a pleasure this is. For those of you who have never met Matilda, this is what she looked like, and this is very much encapsulates the Matilda that I knew. I'd like to just say a few words about Matilda, because I actually did have met her, had met her. I knew her. I mean, she wasn't a bosom buddy, but I had several encounters with her, and it brings me great pleasure both to have this award, but also to think about her. If you read some of the reports about Matilda, some will mention that she was short. And although we're not doing this in person, I can mention that I'm short too. And I always found that endearing. But not only was she short, but she was a force, a real force to talk to listen to. And she was a woman, a professional woman in academia in a time when I think we didn't have that many. And to watch her with the males who were senior at the time was really fun for me, because she was, and I hope this doesn't offend anybody, but she was like a girl in a boys band. They loved her, they appreciated her, they listened to her, she could boss them all around. It was really fun to watch, and it was inspirational for me. When I was very young, assistant professor, I worked with Bob Kahn, and he encouraged me to ask Matilda to be the discussant on a GSA gerontology symposium. Of course, I was scared to death, but I did it. Let me just say, I was young, she was very kind, and said so as though, what's the big fuss? Of course I'll do it. I have a couple of other memories about her that I want to share with you. One is she showed me once a picture of her and her brother. She was 16 years old, and she and he were in Paris at the foot of Étoile, the Arc de Triomphe. And it was just this picture of these two very young people with this great background. The thing that's impressive about it, and still impresses me now, is that she and her brother went to Paris on their own. No parents, no adult supervisor. Her brother, who was not many years older than she, was her only a companion, and they had a great time, and it wasn't a big deal. I don't think many parents would send 16-year-olds to Paris these days on their own, even if they were with their brother. The other memory, it's about the same time she showed me those, that picture of her, was of she and Jack in Paris. My husband and I were doing a sabbatical there, so we were living in Paris. We had 2 small kids at the time, and we had a car. So we offered to pick them up at the airport, which I was born and raised in New York City, so it wasn't a big deal to ride around in Paris or to ride out to the airport. We picked them up, and the kids were very grateful. They told wonderful stories on the way into town. But the funnest thing is that she gave me, I think, my only bottle of Dom Perignon's champagne. And it turned out it was their 50th anniversary. That's why they were coming to Paris to celebrate. And when the flight attendants heard it was their 50th anniversary, they gave them a bottle of champagne, which she gave to us because they weren't, I don't know whether it was because they were on medication or what, but they weren't going to be able to drink it. So we had a wonderful time on that bottle of Dom Perignon, a very, very fond memory. So finally, I'd say that white hair that you see in this picture, that was beautiful white hair. She was tough. I have a great memory of her with a purple suede suit, which at the time I was so impressed with. I love the color purple, and who knew you could do purple suede? She was very New England, very scholarly, and very impressive. So that's my stories about Matilda. Can I have the next? You can just go through the slide. This is what I just told you about, and let's go to the next slide. If Mark, I think it's you who are doing my slides. If you ever watched that TV show with the comedian where she used to go like this, if you're watching me, I'll go like this when I want the next slide, and hopefully you'll be able to move it along without me having to stop. But if not, it's no big deal. I want to say before I begin that just as Matilda was impressive to me and really inspirational, I besides wanting to thank the committee for this award, and as you can see, it's personally very important to me, and I appreciate your efforts and choosing me. I also want to say that I was very impressed with the young people we just heard about and their research. It's just so wonderful to hear the great variety of work, the importance of the work, and the commitment you can see just listening to you present your work. It gives me great hope for the future. And in these days, we need all the positive we can get. So thank you. All right, let me give you a sense of what I want to talk about. As you could tell in my title, I want to talk about cultural lag. I want to talk about the convoy model, which has driven much of my work. I've chosen 5 favorite findings to just give you a sense of the work we've done, the work we've done over the years. I want to talk a little bit about family and friends, or Jane, Lily, and me, and that's meant to be as a little teaser. Then I'm going to talk about social relations in modern times and bring us all back to social relations and structural lag. Next slide, please. All right, let's talk about what structural lag means. If you followed Matilda's research rather than her career as an amazing administrator, you'll know a little bit about this concept of structural lag, which I think was really forthsightful. The idea is that society at large has changed over time. And now, remember, she was talking many years ago, but even then, the lives we were living changed drastically. And we see the evidence today of increased longevity, advances in science and education, the gender revolution, improved public health, and lots of other historical trends and events which we could talk about. And in fact, I will come back to at the very end, talking about the role of technology in our lives. But she also noted, and this is an important part of the structural lag, that numerous aspects of the structure of our society, the roles that guide us and the norms that guide us, have lagged behind these magnificent changes. Next slide, please. The idea of the lag, structural lag, is that there's a mismatch or an imbalance. There are changes in the structures, in the roles. There should be changes, but there aren't. And now you've seen, since the time she first wrote about structural lag, there has been some evolution, but certainly not as much as we need, and we need it now more than ever. I believe we see it in social relations, their shape, form, and functions. This thing about social relations that's especially interesting is that some aspects are the same, and some aspects are so totally different. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I would argue that Matilda was way ahead of her time in the sense of highlighting for us the issue of structural lag. And we are finally catching up, I think, where we're beginning to pay attention to the issue. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about this, the convoy model, which was very much informed with the way, by the way Matilda thought about issues. And if you'll show the next slide, you'll see that I'm going to talk to you about the original updates and modifications and adaptations. This model, which you'll see in the next slide, was originally developed by Bob Kahn and I, who was one of those buddies of Matilda, by the way. I don't think he'd talk about himself this way, but he was one of the boys in the boys' band in the sense of senior social scientists who really respected her and treated her as an equal, and both learned from her and enjoyed her scholarly interactions with her. May I have the next slide, please? The ideas that we try to encapsulate with the original convoy model is that people have multiple close relationships, and that these close relationships are informed by and driven by, you might say, both personal and situational characteristics, which in turn shape the convoy. If you think back about the structural model, that's the situational aspects, the societal aspects, and the personal are those individual aspects that should change along the way, but and are certainly influenced by the structural situational characteristics within which we live. And it is that dual influence that shapes the kinds of social relations you have. The argument we made at the time, and Bob Kahn was a social psychologist who really came from organizational background, whereas I'm a developmental psychologist, came from a lifespan concept. It was a wonderful collaboration in terms of developing theory based on mutually interactive thinking, complementary thinking about theory development, people and society. So we also wanted to recognize the dynamics of development, of cognitive ability, of psychological personality development. All of this occurs over time and is dynamic, which is an important part of the model. And that there were causes and consequences. Things did not just occur randomly, but rather were influenced by things that happened before and resulted in specific outcomes. May I have the next slide? To speak again about some of the concepts that we felt should be incorporated into the model, that relationships, social relations, are lifespan. It's not just a cross-sectional slice of time, although that certainly is part of it, but they develop over time. And one of the books that Matilda wrote or edited was from Aging from Birth to Death. Social relationships are also from birth to death. They're longitudinal, they're hierarchical in the sense that some are more important than others. An important aspect that we wanted to include was the fact that the reality of social relations, if you will, not all social relations are positive. When they're good, they're very good, but they could also be bad. And we thought it was important to recognize that fact and make sure that people didn't feel a need to deny negativity, because it's useful in the sense that you want also to be able to recognize it and counter influence it if you can. Social relations are all often multi-generational. It's part of that being influenced by the family that within which you live, the context within which you live, the society within which you live. Therefore, they also have ethnic, religious, and cultural characteristics. There are some aspects that are universal, if you will. Everybody has mothers and fathers. The role of the mother and father is often different, and some of that is influenced by ethnicity, religion, cultural characteristics. And again, the point I made earlier that social relations have causes and antecedents or antecedents, probably the same thing, but they also have consequences, which is why they're so important. Next slide, please. We wanted to find a way to present that idea diagrammatically. And here you see the very beginnings of our model. We used to call this the spaceship model because if you turned it upside down or sideways, it looks like a spaceship. They're the concepts we were just talking about, properties of the person, properties of the situation. If you'll take that middle part of these three boxes are social relations, if you will, in total. And we narrowed or we further specified social relations to identify social network characteristics, which are objective, if you will. How many people? What are their ages? What's their gender? What's their relationship to you? Objective characteristics. Social support is what we, at the time, what most people thought of as social relations. That is the support people gave and received, what you gave to another or received from another. And we talked about it as aid, affect, and affirmation. Many people use different kinds of ways to define social support, but we like the alliteration of aid, affect, and affirmation, and they are what it sounds like. And then the other aspect of social relations is important is the fact that there's a psychological dimension. You have the objective characteristic of who is in your network. You have the support characteristic, which somewhat objective in the sense of what you give and what you get. But there's also the evaluative dimension, and we have talked about satisfaction or adequacy. It's essentially how you evaluate what you are getting in your world. And although that might sound crass, it's important to mention because we recognize that it could be, you could get the same exact kind of support from somebody, and one person will think it's more than enough, and the other will think it's incredibly inadequate. And as social scientists, and I as a developmental psychologist specifically, really think that it's important to take that dimension into account. And then you take all of the part on this side of the model, and we think all of those things influence the individual's health and well-being. This is essentially a cross-sectional model. If you take a look at the next slide, I'm going to show you a couple of slides quickly now because I don't want to spend time on it, but I do want you to understand the way in which our thinking was originally longitudinal, but we didn't have the data to collect longitudinal data. So we just talked about it cross-sectionally. This is an example of taking the same exact model, but making it longitudinal. So you'll see time on the bottom where we go from actually young childhood through young adulthood, midlife, and older adulthood. And we've taken the spaceship model that I just showed you previously and essentially turned it around so that we can have the same dimensions, but introduce different time periods. Let's go to the next slide. Here we wanted to find a way to pictorially represent how and why we thought social relations were important to influence how an individual can cope with stress. And there you see the middle dimension. On the middle three columns, you have the middle set of columns that talks about stress by social relations. And that was our effort to pictorially represent how social relations can influence an individual's ability to cope with stress. If you would give us the next model, the next slide. Here's an example. I just wanted to provide a demonstration of how we've focused on, the next two slides will show you how we focused on different aspects of the model to address specific questions. So this model comes from a paper by Noah Webster and colleagues that focused on situational characteristics. And we wanted to look at environmental sources and environmental stresses. And we put them in the model as situational characteristics. And we were able to look at how environmental context affects social relations. And I'll come back to that with some findings I'll show you later. Next slide, please. We did some work I won't talk about later because I'm really focusing on all our social relations data, but I wanted to show you this because we did some work on humility and forgiveness, and we wanted to see how the convoy model, how social relations would influence an individual's personal sense of humility and forgiveness. And we personal situational characteristics, the structure of their network, and then talked about the degree to which these characteristics influenced mechanisms that might influence humility and forgiveness. And so we talked about self-efficacy, support quality, trust in others, which over the years we have found to be very important dimensions of social relations in the convoy model. So you see here where we have those characteristics influencing humility and forgiveness, and indeed later influencing well-being. We do have data to support this, which we thought was a very unique and unusual approach to adapting the convoy model. So I guess my bottom line here is that this is a model that has directed my research since literally 1980 and has served us very well in terms of understanding how social relations and how a convoy of support influences health and well-being. Next slide, please. I'd like to talk to you. This was a tough part, how to decide what to talk about. So theory was easy. Now I want to talk about data. And I picked what are literally my 5 favorite findings, but I have to admit they change depending on different findings that come, that I become aware of or that we find in our latest research. All of the findings that I'm going to talk about are based on the social relations study. And although most people give their gratitudes and acknowledgements at the end of the talk, and I will do that as well, I want to frame this work both in terms of the study that I've been working on for many years and how it's been funded. So we began this social relations study in the early 90s, and it was funded by NIMH when they were still doing kind of social relations, non-clinical kind of work. And then, and it was funded to collect regional representative sample of people in the Detroit area, the Detroit metropolitan area. And at the time, we proposed to collect data for people between 5 and up, no end. We would go to households and ask, knock on the door, which is a person coming from New York where we locked the doors. We didn't open the doors to strangers. I always found it amazing that survey researchers could knock on the door and people would open it. But we proposed to do that, and that began a study that has been ongoing for 40 years now, and will continue into the future thanks to recent funding. What was unique about this, and one of the reasons we went to NIMH rather than NIA, which was just beginning, and Matilda was part of it, and I had this explanation to Matilda when she asked me, why didn't we come to NIA? I said, because we wanted to start with children. She was quite indignant and said, aging is from birth to death. So we proposed to do this starting with 5-year-olds. We ended up doing with 8-year-olds because, to be honest, 5-year-old boys couldn't do the kinds of, couldn't answer the questions the way we wanted to ask them. Girls could, but boys couldn't. So we just upped it to 8-year-olds to make it equal for all. Talk about data from various waves of that study. And let's begin with the next slide, please. There is a classic finding in the field that there is a SES health link, socioeconomic status and health link. It won't take any genius to figure out that being poor is bad, having lower socioeconomic status is bad for your health. That's a classic finding. The question we asked was, can social support affect that SES health link? We used our Wave 1 data, and we used education as a proxy for SES. And the finding that I've always been very excited about is that high quality key social relations with a child and close others can erase that SES health link. Only for men, and only for men middle-aged and older. And you can see the reference on the top here, study I did with Christina Schrusch and Mary Jenerick. For those of you who do this kind of work, you know it's really hard to find something, a finding about social relations that includes men, and certainly very unusual to have it include only men. Can I see the next slide, please? We then replicated this finding in Wave 2. Now, one could have thought the finding that I just showed you previously was a fluke, so we're really anxious to see if it would replicate. Bottom line here is, yes, it replicates. And I'll just walk you through 2 graphs to show you. See that solid yellow line in the bottom? Those are people with larger networks. And the dependent variable here is depressive symptomatology. The point to be made is the little difference, the non-significant difference between people with large networks and lower and higher education levels. So there's no difference. That is, it erases that health link, SES health link. But you can see it stays there with people who have the smaller network. So people with smaller networks and lower education have significantly higher depressive symptoms. Let's show, we haven't published this, as Antonucci and Ashush, we haven't published this finding yet. We presented it at I think, a GSA meeting, but we certainly plan to. Can we see the next slide? It essentially replicates it, but now we're using financial care from children. That is, the first question was network size in general. This is a question about, can you get, would you expect that you would get financial help from your child if you needed it or if you asked for it? And basically you see the same finding, lower education and higher education at the bottom, people with who report they would get care, financial care from their child. It doesn't matter if they had lower or higher education, they had the same lower level, and that's a non-significant slope, of depressive symptomatology. By contrast, people who say they couldn't expect or didn't expect financial care from their child have higher levels of depressive symptomatology. I love this finding. I really think it's important because it does show the strength of social relations to overcome some real adversities. Because I do think that SES health finding is real. It's just a matter of how can we make a dent in that finding. Next slide, please. Another finding that is classic in the field is that people with good support live longer. And I would add to that under usual conditions. And I must say, as a young scholar, I love this finding. And I mean, it really showed the strength of social support. What we found is, and this is a study by Antonucci, Burdett, and Webster, what we find is that under life-threatening conditions and or serious illness, people with negative social relations live longer. This was really weird, and really, I must say, it was not only it's not only a favorite finding, but a very a surprising finding for us. I mean, we actually hesitated to publish it for quite a long time until I heard from a colleague of mine, Karen Rook, that she had the same finding. We happened to be at a conference together, and we were, I remember this actually pretty clearly. We were in a garden of the hotel enjoying some quiet time, and we were talking about different aspects of our work. And I said, well, I have this really weird finding, and I don't know what to do with it. She said, we have it too. And that helped me feel a little bit more confident in it. And as we talked about the potential interpretation, it's as though the negative relations, how could I say this, makes you obstinate. It makes you, it gives you some fight to fight the threatening serious health conditions that you're facing. Okay, next is another finding I'm very fond of, and this is about core network relationships, quality of support, context of support, and the kind of support you can give and get. This study we did with Kira Burdett and Lauren Teague, who is an undergraduate and a graduate student with us. The finding, so we looked at, to give you some background, this is a lovely, unique study we were able to do because of supplement funding, an administrative supplement from NIA on our original principal study, so that we have the principal respondents, and we picked principal respondents who said they had significant number, I think it was 3 or more significant life events, negative life events. And we asked them the names of the people that helped them cope with those events. And so they gave us the 3 names. And then we went with the administrative supplement, we went and interviewed those people. So those are the people we're calling core network people. And we asked them, how much did you help the principal with their crisis? And how long did it last? The part that's really interesting about this is that under immediate conditions of high stress, there was no difference in the kind of support you received, regardless of the quality of your relationship. That is, high or low quality of relationship, no matter who's reporting it, you're in there. You hang in there, and you're right there, Johnny come on the spot to help with a crisis. The finding that was most interesting, however, is that under long-term conditions of stress, you only received continued support from the people with whom you had high-quality relationships. So in the short term, everybody's there to help. In the long term, only high-quality relationships hang in there. And I think that's an important caveat about what we can expect from our relationships, how they work, what motivates them. Okay, next slide, please. Here we go back to that issue of environmental context. And first of all, I realized too late that the title on this slide is not correct. It's not a mediating role. It's the network education's effect on self-rated health. And on the vertical, you see 4 dimensions of social, of people with whom you have relationships. So everybody in your network, only the people who you feel closest to, only the people you have the most contact with, and only family. And what you see is the average educational achievement of the network member, not the principal, but their network member. And what I want to point out here is that while controlling for age, gender, race, marital status, and the education of the principal, there is a significant effect of the education of the network members on the self-rated health of the principal for people who they deem as their closest, the people with whom they have the most contact, and the people who they name as family. I think this is really important because it means the characteristics of the network account, not the characteristics of you as the principal, not the characteristics you think about the person or put forth on the person or project the person, but the actual educational characteristics of your network members. Think about the implication of that. I think it brings us to a whole different dimension of what situational characteristics are. Okay, so that's it. Oh, there's one more. The next set, one more in my 5 favorite findings, and on the strength of weak ties. If I could have the next slide, please. We all probably know the classic finding in the great title of this paper done on the strength of weak ties years ago, 1980, I think it was. I quote it often. This is about this is a sort of a take on this, and it's about the strength of weak ties. And here you find, this paper was done by Oliver Huxhold, Kate Fiore, Noah Webster, and myself. And it just got a prize for best publication by the Research on Human Development. And I have to say, this was a wonderful collaboration with 2 former students and a colleague, international colleague. It was really great fun to do this kind of work. So here, what we found is that more weak ties are associated with both less negative affect, more positive affect over time. And that finding is even controlling for self-rated health, number of chronic illnesses, gender, and education. So regardless of the characteristics of the individual, more weak ties are associated with good things, less negative affect and more positive affect. And this is focusing on inner circle size. And we note here that even pruning or reducing outer circle size was not beneficial to well-being. So why do I think this is important? Because we often discuss what's more important, strength, the closer ties or the weaker ties. And I don't mean this to say that weak ties are more important than strong ties. I just want to say here that there is a unique role that weaker ties play, and we're only beginning to understand them. Okay, now I want to take, and that might segue nicely into the next slide and a little video I want to show you about, oh, wait a minute, sorry, I forgot about this slide. This is about weak ties in technology and health. This is another finding about weak ties that I really thought would help us understand a little bit about how weak ties are working and the changing nature of weak ties, because technology is allowing us to maintain weak ties in ways that never happened before. So this finding is about the mediating effect. That is, among people with more weak ties, those who use technology have lower levels of depressive symptomatology. So here, technology is helping people with more weak ties. But there's also a moderating effect in that among people with less frequent network contact, using tech improves their subjective well-being. That's depressive symptomatology, self-rated health, life satisfaction. So I think we live in a world that certainly is having the effect of technology influencing our social relations, influencing our life in many ways. But I think it behooves us to understand the many ways in which it has. And this is just about the ways in which it influences weak ties. And then I think my argument here is having a positive effect. Okay, now I want to segue now to family and friends and talk about Jane, Lily, and me. We can go to the next slide and to this. Jane is Jane Fonda, who is a native New Yorker. Lily is Lily Tomlin, who is a native Detroiter. And I want you to hear about what they have to say about friendship. 5 minutes worth. But I think and hope you'll find it fascinating.
So I was thinking about female friendship a lot. And by the way, these two women, I'm very honored to say, have been my friends for a very long time, too.
Yes, we have.
And one of the things that I read about female friendship is something that Cervantes said. He said, you know, you can tell a lot about someone, in this case, a woman, by the company that she keeps. So let's start with...
We're in big trouble.
I need one of those waters. I'm extremely dry.
You're taking up our time. We have a very limited.
Just being with her sucks the life out of me.
You ain't seen nothing yet. Anyway,
so
sorry.
Tell me, what do you look for in a friend?
I look for someone who has a sense of fun, who's audacious, who's forthcoming, who has politics, who has even a small scrap of passion for the planet, someone who's decent, has a sense of justice, and who thinks I'm worthwhile.
You know, I was thinking this morning, I don't even know what I would do without my women friends. I mean, I have my friends, therefore I am. No, it's true. I exist because I have my women friends. You're one of them. I don't know about you, but anyway, they make me stronger. They make me smarter. They make me braver. They tap me on the shoulder when I might be in need of course correcting. And most of them are a good deal younger than me too. You know, I mean, it's nice.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, I do. I include you in that because listen, you know, it's nice to have somebody still around to play with and learn from when you're getting toward the end.
I'm glad.
And I'm approaching. I'll be there sooner than you.
I'm glad to have you parallel aging alongside me.
I'm showing you the way. No,
well, you are, and you have.
Well, as we grow older and as we go through different kinds of life's journeys, what do you do to keep your friendships vital and alive?
Well, you have to use a lot of
She doesn't invite me over much, I'll tell you that.
I have to use a lot of social media. You be quiet now. And so I look through my emails, I look through my texts to find my friends so I can answer them as quickly as possible because I know they need my counsel. They need my support because most of my friends are writers or activists or actors, and you're all three, and a long string of other descriptive phrases. And I want to get to you as soon as possible. I want you to know that I'm there for you.
Do you do emojis?
Oh,
No?
that's embarrassing.
I'm really into emojis.
No, I spell out my words of happiness and congratulations and sadness.
You spell it right out.
I spell it every letter.
Such a purist. You know, as I've gotten older, I've understood more the importance of friendships, and so I really make an effort to reach out and make play dates, not let too much time go by. I read a lot, so as Lily knows all too well, I send my books that I like, I send to my friends.
When we knew we would be here today, you sent me a lot of books about women-female friendships, and I was so surprised to see how many books, how much research has been done recently.
And were you grateful?
I was grateful. And wait, no, it's really important because this is another example of how women are overlooked, put aside, marginalized. There's been very little research done on us, even though we volunteered lots of times. No, this is really exciting, and you all will be interested in this. The Harvard Medical School study has shown that women who have close female friendships are less likely to develop impairments, physical impairments as they age, and they are likely to be seen to be living much more vital, exciting,
and longer,
joyful lives.
We live 5 years longer than men.
I think I'd trade the years for joy. But the most important part is they found the results were so exciting and so conclusive that the researchers found that not having close female friends is detrimental to your health as much as smoking or being overweight.
Wow. And you know, and there's something else too.
I've said my part. So.
Okay, well, listen to my part, because
Okay.
there's an additional thing that, because they only, for years, decades, they only researched men when they were trying to understand stress. Only very recently have they researched what happens to women when we're stressed. And it turns out that when we're stressed, women, our bodies get flooded by oxytocin. Which is a feel-good, calming, stress-reducing hormone, which is also is increased when we're with our women friends. You know, and I do think that's one reason why we live longer. And I feel so bad for men because they don't have that. Testosterone in men diminishes the effects of oxytocin.
Well, when you and I and Dolly made 9 to 5,
oh,
we laughed so much. We found we had so much in common, and it's so different. Here she is like Hollywood royalty. I'm like a tough kid from Detroit. She's a Southern kid from a poor town in Tennessee. And we found we were so in sync as women. And we laughed till we must have added at least a decade onto our lifespan.
Okay, perfect. We have the next slide, please? Like I said, I don't usually show, and it's not often the case that Hollywood movie stars are an important part of anything I want to say, but I just thought this was wonderful. First of all, those women are 80 and 82, and Jane Fonda is the older one, as she said to Lily Tomlin, and they just speak to the strength of friendships. I mean, even if you don't follow much of Hollywood, you know that a lot of Jane Fonda's life has been around the men in her life. And Lily Tomlin, by contrast, this has not been the case. But they still have the same message about what's important about family, about friends. So I want to say a question in the literature has been, is it family and friends, family or friends, and family versus friends? So we have asked the question, what's more important? Can one make up for the other, et cetera? And I want to address next slide. This work is by Jasmine Menelel, who is right there with you. If you were there physically, she'd be right there, but she's currently doing a postdoc with you at the National Human Genome Research Institute. As part of her dissertation. And what we looked, remember I told you we had 8-year-olds, so we looked at the 8 to 12-year-olds and we looked at their report of who's close and important to them, who's in their network. Essentially, we had to child adapt those questions. But basically looking at their profiles, they 50% of those kids, there were about 250, 55% identified varied family as their profile types, 23% close family, and 21% family and friends. And you see there the kinds of measures we put in to define the profiles. The interesting thing is these are unique in that they're child profiles, and there's only 3 of them. I'd like to show you, and notice that the most frequent is varied family. That's an interesting finding, and we're working on what it means and how it predicts to outcomes in adulthood. If we could have the next slide, I want to show you here profiles for adults. And here you find that diverse profiles is the most frequent. That is, 32% of the people said they had both family and friends in their network. And then you see declining numbers. So 24% had only friends, 16 only non-family, 16 only non-friends, and 12% family. The point I want to make here is really about this outcome, because numerous studies have shown that people with the diverse networks, luckily the most frequent, are the people who are the most satisfied and least depressed. Whereas people with non-family networks are less satisfied and more depressed. Some studies have found, had kind of combined that and would have what's called a restricted network or restricted profile. And those people are often the most negatively affected in terms of health and well-being. So it is clear that it's family and friends that make up the most advantageous profile for adults, social network profile. But I will add that, remember way back when I was describing a convoy, that I said they were influenced by ethnic, racial, religious, cultural factors. Imagine a culture where women are not allowed to mix with men. Imagine a culture where people are not expected to or allowed to mix with non-family members. Imagine cultures where families, everybody has 10 kids, so everybody's family. And so you could see in the different kinds of cultures, their profile is likely to vary. But the point I wanted to make here is that diversity seems to be the best bet for people in terms of their health and well-being. We could spend a lot of time on that, but I feel like we don't have a lot of time. But I'd like to suggest that people should think about what makes the diversity helpful. And what I would argue is that family and friends serve different functions. I mean, you don't have, if you're an 80-year-old, you don't have the same relationship with your children and grandchildren as you do with a peer. Even if you're a 50-year-old, it's just not the same. So I think it's the diversity that's most useful. Let us come back to some sum-up points I'd like to make. If I could have the next slide, I want to talk about social relations and structural lag in modern times. And here I want to go back to the point that Matilda made way back when, where society isn't catching up with where people are. And here it may be bidirectional in that where society has changed, people aren't catching up. And I do think it's bidirectional. So let's take the whole notion of technology, of social media, of computer use, internet use. One of the only good things that might be happening from this pandemic and the stay at home is that people of all ages who had been resistant to internet access and use, social media use, are breaking down and finding ways to use those new technological resources. However, there's no denying there is a digital divide. It's based on age, it's based on finances, it's based even on region of the country. Rural folks, for example, are much more likely to have limited access. Whether they want it or not, they're likely to have regional limited access. Another issue that I think we need to think about is what's happened to privacy. I mean, there used to be a time when everything was private, or at least people protected their privacy. Now I'm astounded at how much people will put on Facebook, how much they're willing to say in social media, stuff that I'm frequently saying, please don't share. And I wonder if this is something, my first thought is always that it's often younger people who do this, and I worry that when they get older, they'll not be happy about what they shared. But maybe I'm wrong about that. Maybe it's me as an old person. I have cling to privacy that's no longer important. It's probably somewhere in between, but I think it affects social relations because you can be outed about things you don't expect to be or don't anticipate. Like I read something about, I don't know, somebody was committing a crime and he tweeted about it, or he puts a post on his Facebook. I mean, that's a case where privacy might have been a little helpful for that guy. Needless to say, he got caught. Also, there are clear educational and informational barriers and benefits. So we know that people who have educational advantages also have access to more information, which provides them a lot of information and access to other things in their lives that are useful. And that's, again, a situation where I'd like to say it's all going in the right direction, but I don't think so. The data on education aren't great. Instead of it increasing in all directions, there are some groups that are really benefiting, but other groups where education is increasingly at risk, whether it's the quality of the education when they're subject to mandatory education in the sense that in this country you have to go to school until a certain age, or whether it's just the quality of the education. These differences are really having an effect on the outcomes. And I think we're in a situation where we should use the modern technology that's available to give equal access to everyone. Another thing about technology that I worry about is the lack of accountability and responsibility. That is, you can say anything on Twitter, just to name a particular social media outcome, and there's no real responsibility. There seems to be, sometimes people are shamed for what they've said, but in terms of legality, there seems to be no responsibility or accountability about what people put out there. Similarly, there's a lack of filtering. You would think that people would filter what they put out there, but they don't seem to. And you would think that people might filter what comes into their world, and they seem not to. So that's one argument. The complete opposite argument is there's total filtering, so that, and I can spend a lot of words, but I could just say, think of the people who listen to CNN and the people who listen to Fox News. They live in different worlds. Occasionally I listen, I'm not going to give away, though you could probably figure which one I watch regularly. Occasionally I watch the others just to see, okay, how could this be interpreted differently? And let me say that I am stunned by the way in which the same facts can be interpreted. It's a far cry from my childhood when you got the news on 3 stations on TV, and although they had different broadcasters, they broadcasted the same news in the same objective way. That's not what's happening in CNN and Fox, and it's changing really the nature of the world in which we live. And finally, along the same theme, we have the whole notion of fake news, where people can just say it's not true, or people could say things that are not true. And there seems, again, to be no repercussions for that. And I think these last two matters, well, actually, I think all of these are threatening our society in important ways, creating bigger divides, and threatening the nature of social relations. One of the things, social relations depends on people interacting with each other. And if you live in the CNN world and not in the Fox News world, or if you live in the Fox News and not in the CNN world, those other guys can be created as total monsters in a way that's just not possible if you're actually talking with each other, if you're actually interacting with each other, if you're actually hearing the same news, if you will, in an unbiased way. So I think we're living in a time where the structural lag is both influencing our social relations and influencing so many other aspects of our world. Next slide, please. So I just want to sum up here and say that, as you know, as we all know, we are living in a world with many, many challenges. I could enumerate them, but unfortunately we're living them, so I don't think I have to do that. These are unprecedented times. I do think that social relations can help, but I also think they can hinder. And I would love to see the work in this field devoted towards identifying the ways in which social relations can help outcomes, and also preventing the ways in which they can hinder outcomes. Even the work we heard about earlier on e-cigarette use, on pregnancy outcomes, on colorization. I mean, all of these things are influenced by social relations, and I think that the degree to which we can use social relations to have a positive outcome would benefit society in general. I think you've heard from what I've said, hopefully you have, that social relations are both personal and situational, and we need to influence them. We need to understand both of them, and we need to not be influenced unmindfully, but rather structure the ways in which, and take an active, proactive way in which these things influence us, and how we understand that we are influenced by them. And finally, I do really believe that social relations can and do help people. I think it can help us with the structural lag we face, and I think they can help us with the new age and all the challenges we are currently facing. If I could have the next slide. So this is a picture of Matilda getting an honorary degree from the University, State University of New York at Baltimore. And I like this because of all the purple in it. And I remember Matilda with a lot of purple. So she was thanking people, and I want to thank you. And if I can have the next slide. I really would like to thank Matilda White Riley for being a person who was inspirational. I mean, she inspired me, and I'm sure she inspired a lot of other young women. I love the role she played with senior men and women in the field, although there weren't a lot of women in the field at the time. She was a tough cookie. She didn't suffer fools lightly, and I was glad she didn't think I was one of the fools she would have had to suffer. That's probably because I was too young to notice, but she was an important influence on me and on the field. I'd like to thank OPSSR for the award, the National Institutes of Health, and NIMH for all the support they've given me over the years. Really, it's been very, the funding I've received for the work that I reported to you today, and many other findings along the way, could really not have been done without the support from NIH. And I'd like to thank you, each of you who are listening, even under these impossible virtual conditions. I wonder if anybody's still awake out there. Thank you for listening. And even if you're not awake, thank you for starting out with to listen. I know it's tough to listen to a 1-hour talk virtually. And I'll stop there. I'm happy to entertain questions.
Thank you so much, Tony. We really appreciate this. I hope that you can imagine some very enthusiastic applause right now, because it must be hard to kind of talk into a void a bit.
It really is tough.
We really appreciate your reflections on Matilda White Riley. It's so nice to hear stories from people who actually knew her. I find it hard to believe that nobody has questions. I don't see any at the moment, but I imagine and hope that they're coming in. I actually had a question back to, I think it was your first favorite finding, when you talked about the expectations of financial care from the kids. And I'm wondering if either you've done research in that area, or if you can speculate if that's kind of a finding specific to countries where there isn't such a financial security net. I'm wondering if you think that maybe in countries like Sweden or something like that, that would be less of a finding.
Huh. What an interesting question. I think that, so the reason I like that finding is because it's counter to the classic finding, and because it's about men. And it's about men and not about women. Now, we have a lot of findings on women and outcomes and the importance of social relations. Honestly, I think it's more complex than just the finance of it. I think men have trouble saying they're close to people. I mean, it's okay to say you're close to your wife, but it's not so close. It's, you know, and it's okay to say you're close to your children, but often men don't know how to express that. And I think this idea that your child would support you financially is kind of this, I was going to say over the line, but it might be the wrong words to express. It's a kind of unique way for a man to say that he has a special relationship with someone, and someone you're allowed to have a special relationship with. That is your child, right? Men are not so comfortable with close friends. It's okay if you're in a group. It's okay if you're talking about sports. But this, I think, is a unique window into how men feel about relationships, and I don't feel like we've really tapped that. We've gotten to the depth of it. I think this is just an important finding because it's a window into that unique relationship. I think it may not be the same in other countries. They may need a different window to catch men, if you will, and how they're. So, you know, it's a long-standing issue for years and years, difference between men and women on social relations. And I never, even though objectively, we often can't find the same findings from men that we do with women, I refuse to believe that social relations aren't important for them. I just think it's what our culture has put on them, that they're not allowed to express it. They're not, maybe not even recognize it for themselves in the same way women are.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. So another question we have is, someone is wondering about the idea of structural lag and how social networks themselves might represent structural lag in terms of when need for support arises and when personal network members can respond to that need over the life course. Excuse me.
I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of that. Could you say that again?
Sure. Someone is wondering about the idea of structural lag.
Mm-hmm.
And how social networks themselves might represent structural lag in terms of when need for support arises and when personal network members can respond to that need over the life course.
Yes, yes, and yes. Absolutely. I think even who's in your network will change, has changed, different. And that's what we're trying to get on in terms of looking at profiles. That I showed you, the ones for children versus for adults. We're trying to get at what it means and in what kind of context. We have a long-standing finding that I didn't get into about the structure of network by SES. And interestingly enough, poor people tend to have family relations significantly more than people who have both higher levels of education and higher levels of income. And I think, and this is another reason why I think family and friends, the family friends issue is important. Friends, I think, are a luxury. Family, I mean, it's not that I'm being Pollyanna about it. It's not that I think all family relations are good. God knows that's not true. But I think if you live in a world that's threatening or unsupportive or that you do not feel comfortable with, there's a certain level of confidence you can have about your family because they are family, that you can't have about strangers, non-family, who you really don't know what their underlying feelings are. So the world you live in will shape the network, who's in your network, and that's why I went into this whole long thing about SES. And what you need differs by where you are in life. You know, kids probably don't need an extensive friendship network. You know, think of a 2-year-old. Maybe 1 or 2 kids you play with, but that's not going to influence your fundamental security, to use the attachment literature, the attachment terminology. As you get older, I would say, and that's why weak ties start to become important. As you get older, friends give you another world. They open another world that your family can't. And weaker ties open another world still that extends your world in a way that that your family and close network can't. I could go on and on, but I'll let it stop at that. And whoever asked that question, if they want to go on, that's fine. They can ask me offline.
Okay, I'm gonna jump to a question from our director, Bill Riley. Social disruption from social distancing is having complex effects on social relations. So you're closer with your family, weaker relationships with those outside of your family, and more virtual than in person. What would your research predict are the potential health and well-being outcomes from these last 3 months of social distancing?
Well, I'm so glad you asked that, because the one thing I have to say is the pandemic has led even politicians to understand that social relations are important and that social isolation is important. I mean, listening to Governor Cuomo talk about reach out, I couldn't tell whether that was the politician in him or the Italian in him. You'll be surprised to know I'm also Italian. But politicians of all sorts, sizes, and shapes have really talked about the negative effects of social isolation. I think that's really important. And also, we hear, sadly, the increase of domestic violence, of people really not able to cope with the isolation they're feeling. So I think we have so I don't even want to say bidirectional, because I think it's hard on everybody, but it's just a lot harder on some people than it is on other people. And it's like so many other things. Those, the have better, and the have-nots have worse. You know, so people who, like, I have been to 3 places in the last 3 months, to the doctor's office, to the pharmacy, and to the grocery. Literally 3 places. I mean, I even can't believe it myself. But I have a lovely house. I have great connectivity. I have a park I can go for a walk in. I mean, I'm living in a pretty good world here, even though I'm disrupted, certainly. Think about people who I was on a call with a person, and it was really, really loud. And I didn't have the heart to ask him why it was so loud. It was clear there was a lot of people around. Finally, somebody else said, "How many people do you live with?" And he said 12. And I thought, 12 people, that's a different kind of disruption. So I think it's bringing out the best in some people, and it's bringing out the worst in some people. That isn't to say that, I'll say just one more thing. I think it's also taught us that we could help people. I mean, there are things we can do to help people. And that's a nice thing. Those people who are giving hints or suggestions about how to help others, kids playing concerts for elderly neighbors or drive-by happy birthdays and graduation ceremonies. I mean, we can help people. And I think I'm hopeful, this is me being Pollyanna, I am hopeful that this experience will bring a whole new respect for social science.
I love that silver lining to all of this, which leads, and now I hear an echo, but wondering if you've given any thought to about what types of policies, key activities, or education programs we could implement to broaden relationship access to health disparity populations, to improve the diversity of relationships personally and professionally, and to health equity.
Great question. I have, actually. In one of my other worlds, I happen to currently have the honor of being the president of the International Society for the Study of Behavioral Development. We had a meeting scheduled for Rhodes, actually, in a few weeks, which we had to cancel. But in my communication to the members, I actually am right now preparing a statement where I say that it's important to take this moment and think about the ways, now that's the Society for the Study of Behavioral Development, but it's true of human development in general and social science in general. Can we think of ways to apply our science to the problems that we face? And I think the answer to that is yes. I think, we've gone the whole gamut from teaching people years and years ago that they had to be in that ivory tower and relevant wasn't relevant to them, to where we are now, where we're much more interested in the importance of application. I think we can teach people the importance of social relations, the importance of reaching out, the importance of giving as well as receiving. And I don't think this should always be about giving. I think it should be about receiving. Sometimes it's important to receive, sometimes it's important to give. And if we teach people that that's part of the whole cycle of life, I think that would be a benefit. Last night there was a show on TV on implicit bias. Who would think that you could get a primetime TV show on implicit bias, where many people are learning about how they may be implicitly biased, even if they're sure down to their core that they're not prejudiced and that they don't discriminate. In fact, it's very likely that they do it based on their background. So I think there's lots of things we can talk about and we can specify and we can teach people at all ages, from the very young child, what do you have to give to others? And what would it be kind of you to receive from others? And up to old people. Old people also have a lot to give, not only to receive. I do dislike the fact that we often talk about old people on the receiving end. Poor old people, they have nothing, we have to take care of them. There's a lot to give, and Matilda's a great example. I actually didn't realize that she was 68 when she took her job at NIA and had already retired from 2 jobs, a full academic career at Rutgers and then one at Bowdoin College. I mean, older people have a lot to give, and we should be teaching everybody, that people of all ages, that we have not only the ability, but the responsibility to give and receive at all ages.
Which leads nicely into the next question about how does or can the educational system foster these positive social relationships? The commenter thinks that it would be important to start this early, as I think you just mentioned.
Right.
But maybe you can elaborate a little bit more.
Well, one thing I'll slip in, which is probably political, but I think it's something that actually Cuomo said in one of his press conferences. We should have equal funding for education for all schools. It's ridiculous that you can live in one neighborhood and get 10 times the funding for education as you can in another neighborhood. I mean, and this isn't just a political plug. It's really hard to think about improving the world when you're hungry. It's really hard to think about ways in which you can help others when you can barely help yourself. So that's not just a pie in the sky kind of thing. It's really very. I think, yeah, you could teach at every level, and I think we should require it at every level. Some schools require that kids do volunteer work. I think we should require that of everybody. I think we should have the way some countries have a year or 2 years, whatever it is, of military service. I'm certainly not recommending military service, but we should build into our educational system a responsibility to others. I remember when I was a kid, there was a big movement that if you saw garbage, trash on the sidewalk, you should pick it up. I mean, it's that kind of things. I remember when there was a big play to get kids, get people to stop smoking. And my own kids, who are now in their 30s, they were primary school. They said to me, "Mom, I really feel bad about so-and-so and her mother." And I was like, "Oh, what? They're going to tell me something awful, like child beating or something?" No, her mother smokes. It was like they had learned so completely that one shouldn't smoke. And similarly, when we had a big play for wearing seatbelts, it was the kids who got the parents to wear seatbelts because they would say, "I don't want you to die." So yeah, we could start early, and we could start to have people understand the way comments influence people. I think that's why cyberbullying is so, pardon the expression, popular, because you don't have to look somebody in the eye when you do it. If you look somebody in the eye when you said some of these evil things, I think it would be much harder to do. Hope that gave something of an answer.
Absolutely. The next question is, how do you think the narrative changes when children immigrate to a different social structure that is dichotomous to this culture or society that they transition from?
So they come to this society from another culture?
Yes.
Well, can be very good, can be very bad. I mean, we know something about this. So we know that for young children, for example, who often learn the language faster than the rest of the family, they become the translators. They have a critical role for the family, and I think that's a plus and a minus, because the parents sometimes lose the power, the authority they had. We also know it's a burden on the kid to have that kind of responsibility. There's an additional problem of the child growing up with the values of this country and trying to live between two worlds. As a professor at a major university, I dealt with a lot of students who are choosing a field because their parents chose it for them. They hate it. It's not a matter of how smart they are. It's a matter of what you love. And my feeling about education is it gives you the privilege of being able to do what you love, but they are living in a world where they don't have that privilege. So that goes to who they marry, what they major in, et cetera. So there are big problems. Can we help? Yeah, I think we can. We could have essentially a cultural welcome wagon where we have people who have the right attitude, who can reach out to all members of the family to give them some help in the crossroads they'll face. I think very frequently the crossroads are identifiable. We know when there will be problem areas. What do we do? What do we do if we, I mean, I think we can help in that we can help people transition. There will be some places where we can't, and what do we do then? And that's a problem. I mean, there are where it's appropriate, I say that in quotes, to hit women. What do we do when that comes to this culture? Well, we're pretty clear about what we do, but that's in public. What do we do about when it happens in private? No, we got to work on that. I don't think we have an easy answer. So bottom line is we can do some things. I certainly think we don't do what we can, even what we know we can do, we don't do, and I think we could do more. That's why it's nice when people come from in an organized fashion from somewhere and they're welcomed by a church or a community group or some group that helps with the transition. I think that's our best help.
Thank you for that response. The next question is, how do you understand the construct of loneliness and its association with perceived social relations and depression, particularly among older adults?
Well, loneliness, I was going to say I'm happy to see, but you understand in a bizarre kind of intellectual way that people are paying attention to loneliness. And I'm also happy to see that we have nice, solid data on the effects of loneliness. It's not just psychological. We now know, thanks in large part to John Cassiopio's work, on the physical effects of loneliness. I think that's impressive. But you know, my commitment to the field of social relations spans many decades, from the decades when people felt there was no real effect of it, that it was just psychological and it wasn't a real effect. And even when the early findings that there was an association between social relations and mortality, I used to like to say that that was a nice hard variable, because they would say it was a soft finding. I would say dead, not dead. It's a very clear variable, not arguable. I think now we're at the point where we recognize that's true about loneliness. I think we need to work on two fronts here. We need to have society recognize that loneliness is a problem, and it's a problem for all ages. And I think there'll be some lifespan continuity in loneliness. But I also think there's some loneliness issues that are specific to old age, again, because of the structural lag, because we don't have as many roles for older people as we should, as they can manage. And I think here should be the other side, where we train people as we prepare people for retirement. We prepare them to anticipate and offset loneliness through proactive activities. You know, I mean, I'm not saying everybody should take up golf, but I am saying that people should recognize that there should be the same way we've told people how to manage the pandemic. How do you manage your day? Get up at the same time, take a shower, get out of your pajamas. These kinds of things. We need to say the same things for people who are confronting loneliness. That's people who are within a normal range. Now, there are going to be people who are going to be in a clinical range, and I think they need more significant intervention. Now, I don't think I can get into that here, but I think a weird thing to say, everyday loneliness, I think we can offset with activities that we can set for ourselves and that we can recommend for ourselves and for others.
Thank you so much. I think I am getting the signal now that we need to wrap up, so that Bill Riley can say a few closing remarks. Tony, I thank you so much for this wonderful talk and the chance to discuss things afterwards. Again, I hope that you can imagine a large round of virtual applause for you.
Thank you.
And thank you so much.
Very much.
Bill, I think I'll turn it over to you now.
Hey, thank you so much, Erica. I want to just take a moment before we close to just thank all of our presenters and our honorees. Tony Antonucci is a distinguished lecturer. Thank you very much. For early stage investigators, and I concur with Tony's point, I always feel good about the future of our sciences when I hear early stage investigators speak. And so to Julia Chen-Sankey, Drew Rothenberg, James Slaughter-Acey, and Brad Turnbull, thank you so much for your presentations as well. I want to thank particularly the people who We're part of putting all this together, both from a logistic perspective, but also, as you know, Erica's group looks at lots of nominations to be able to determine who will be our distinguished lecturer each year. Bill Elwood's group looks at hundreds of early stage investigator papers to help select the few that will present each year. So for all of the people, and that's a massive undertaking by a lot of folks across the National Institutes of Health, thank you all very much. And finally, for all of you who have participated today and done it virtually, hopefully next year we do this again together. I'm personally missing a little in-person contact, so it's great to have more people online as well. So thank you all very much, and this ends our event today. Thank you.